Hello everyone, welcome to my tremendously low quality production. For some reason, the software that I'm using is not letting me use my super HD camera that's $20 or whatever, so I just have to use my built-in MacBook camera, but don't worry, doesn't matter all that much because this is just a little intro. I'm going to be screen sharing sometime soon. But what are we doing today? Well, I guess the more important question is, how are you doing today? Let me know in the comments section how you're doing today, Yeah, what are we doing today? Well, I'm going to be responding to a recent video by Trent Horn, and in that video, Trent Horn is responding to Skydive Phil's documentary on the Kalam. I watched only so far the first 4 or 5 minutes of Trent's video, and I was like, hey, this is going to be interesting enough, and I already have things to say in response that, I might as well just make a video on it. A few notes before we get started. Firstly, this is not going to be a video that I'm editing at all. I have a little pause button up in the top left that allows me to pause, but I'm not going to be editing this. And so you're going to see more verbal slip-ups, more things like that, more ums, and so on. But we're just going to have to deal with that, okay? Don't worry, I'll try to minimize it, and it's not like it's obstructive in any manner. But that's just a forewarning that this isn't going to be an uber-polished video. And of course, a few prefatory remarks. As usual, in all my video responses to Trent, I like to emphasize at the beginning that we're here for love and for service, right? We're trying to serve people and show them love and exhibit the intellectual and moral virtues in the process. So we're not trying to knock down Trent here in any manner. Instead, we should emphasize love. And so I want to say at the outset that, yes, I love Trent's work, I love his attitude, and I love Trent. So that's what I'm going to say at the outset. The second thing that I'm going to say is check out my Kalam playlist, because I go into all of the arguments that we're about to be considering and all the justifications that we're about to be considering in much more detail with scholars who publish in the field and who have published recent papers on these various topics. So check out my Kalam playlist. That will be linked in the description as well. And I'll add this video to the Kalam playlist as well. Well, as you can see, I'm kind of stupid because all I had to do was click a little button in the bottom right-hand corner, and now I have the HD webcam. But yeah, we're just going to have to... I'm not re-recording that, so sorry about that. Alright, so I am putting Trent's video at 1.5 times speed, just for any of you who are listening to the current video that you are watching right now on a higher speed. So that's just a forewarning, but yeah, anyway, let's get into it.
Hey everyone, in today's rebuttal, I'm going to look at the YouTube channel Skydive Phil, and they have a whole documentary that criticizes the Kalam cosmological argument. Now, this argument was popularized by the Protestant philosopher and theologian William Lane Craig, and it gets discussed a lot because it's deceptively simple. It goes like this. Whatever begins to exist has a cause for its existence. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause for its existence. Now, this isn't an argument for God strictly. You have to do an analysis of what the cause of the universe would be. And if it's the cause of all space-time, matter, and energy, you would do an analysis showing it has divine properties. So in this video, this atheist who goes by the name Skydive Phil, he actually does like a whole documentary where he interviews scientists and philosophers who critique the Kalam argument. It's got really slick production values. It looks great, technically speaking. But ultimately, I was disappointed because people like William Lane Craig, they have provided answers to the objections that are raised in this documentary. And a lot of those just simply aren't included. Many of them can be found in the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology. In that book, Craig and a co-author, James Sinclair, they've written one of the best defenses of the Kalam argument in print. So I'll be citing a lot from that. Okay, now...
Okay, so there's a number of things to say here, but let me just pause this to collect my thoughts. So I know that Trent is just making certain prefatory remarks on his end, but of course they're not going to be going into all the particular minutiae of Craig's responses to the rejoinders that they provide in the video. One reason for that is that there have been further rejoinders to what Craig says in that 2009 article in the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology. In fact, pretty much every single thing that pretty much every single thing that William Lane Craig has said in there has been systematically critiqued and appraised in the literature since 2009. Alex Malpass and Wes Morriston and a bunch of other authors have published lots of different papers criticizing almost every single aspect of what William Lane Craig says in that Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology chapter. And so, yeah, of course, a lot of the criticisms that are raised within the documentary are themselves addressed by Craig in that 2009 article, but the same thing applies to that 2009 article. There have been further rejoinders to that. I mean, what, do you want them to cover those further rejoinders? Well, then will they have to cover further rejoinders to that, and then further rejoinders to that? No. At some point, you just have to satisfy. So you have to include what you have to include given time constraints and so on. You're not going to be able to present absolutely every single rejoinder that Craig gives in some of Craig's published work, partly because you might think that there are even better responses to what Craig says by way of response, that have since then been published. And so you don't think it would be worth going into all the particular minutiae. Perhaps you think that what Craig says is particularly implausible and has already been dealt with in, let's say, a 2020 article by Malpass and Morriston. My point here is just simply that I don't quite see how this is a particularly cogent or persuasive criticism of the video itself and its contents, or the documentary that is, simply because, yeah, while Craig has responded to a lot of things they say in there have been other responses to what Craig says. And so, if they don't think that what Craig says is convincing, partly because of these other responses that have been published to Craig's rejoinders, they're perfectly well within their rights in simply not including Craig's responses. Importantly, moreover, I don't even think that they suggest or intimate that they're giving the be-all end-all, or that Craig hasn't even responded to the criticisms that they're raising. No, they're just trying to put the criticisms on people's radars. So anyway, I don't think Trent's point here is, I don't know, it just doesn't seem it seems neither here nor there by my lights. But anyway, let's continue. And sorry, I'm a little bit incompetent at this, so I'm just going to have to go back and forth with pausing and playing. But yeah, we're just dealing with it.
But that being said, though, let's take a look at Skydive Phil's criticism of the Kalam argument. And in this response, I'm going to focus on the first half of his video that just deals with the Kalam and the philosophical arguments for the beginning of time. That's what we'll do here in part 1.
Creation stories of Pacific Islanders tell us the world was made from a volcano. Other origin myths say the world came from water. But contemporary science tells us that the world evolved from a Big Bang. And the outdated view that this marks an absolute beginning has been used by religious philosophers, most notably William Lane Craig, to revive an old argument for God, known as the Kalam cosmological argument.
First, I feel like this introduction subtly tries to equate Christian philosophy that would show the universe had a beginning with ancient myths, as if Craig's argument is just a fancy version of a primitive myth.
Okay, so there are a number of things to say here. Firstly, they didn't mention Christian philosophy. They mentioned religious philosophy. And then they mentioned one particular champion of the argument, which is William Lane Craig, who is indeed a Christian, of course. But that's not Christian philosophy. I don't know where he's getting this Christian philosophy thing. Secondly, let me get the exact thing that Craig said, Craig. I'm going to be making those mistakes a lot, but let me get the exact thing that Trent said.
Christian philosophy that would show the universe had a beginning with ancient introduction subtly tries to equate Christian philosophy that would show the universe had a beginning with ancient myths, as if Craig's argument is just a fancy version of a primitive myth.
So that doesn't strike me at all to be a plausible or charitable interpretation of the introduction of this documentary. They're not equating the Kalam or Craig's argument or religious philosophy or Christian philosophy with ancient origin myths. When you have a beginning of the video, oftentimes you want to capture people's attention. Something that would definitely capture people's attention is having a giant volcano eruption at the beginning and talking about origin myths. To me, that seems kind of cool, kind of interesting. And notice what they did in the contrast. The contrast wasn't between, or notice what they did, situating things next to one another within their video. They didn't say, oh, here are some origin myths, and then compare those to Craig's argument for the beginning of the past. No, they said, here are some origin myths, but here's what science actually tells us, right? Those origin myths are false. Here's what actually science tells us. Science tells us that our local spatiotemporal manifold began to expand a finite time ago. Okay? Science tells us that our local spatiotemporal manifold began to expand a finite time ago. And then, after they made that point, the contrast was between what contemporary science reveals and ancient creation myths. And then after they made that comparison, they had a long pause, and then went on to transition and saying, this recent scientific evidence, this scientific discovery, what science says about our local spatiotemporal manifold, has been latched onto by certain religious philosophers to revive an old argument for God's existence. To me, that doesn't at all seem to be equating this religious argument or this philosophical argument for God's existence with these myths of the past. The myths of the past were used, firstly, as an introduction to grab people's attention, and secondly, to contrast that with what we now know from contemporary science. And once that was done, they transitioned to saying, but now, this contemporary science has itself revived an old philosophical debate and has been used by proponents of the Kalam cosmological argument to argue for a scientifically informed, so they say, view of the beginning of the universe as caused by something beyond space, matter, energy, and so on, given the Kalam cosmological argument. So it just seems, well, I don't know. I have to confess, it just seems straightforwardly false to me that they are equating in some problematic manner Craig's argument, or the Kalam cosmological argument, or religious or Christian philosophy concerning the origins of the universe and time and whatnot, with these superstitious, outdated, ludicrous creation myths, if we can say if we can say that. I know that's not being charitable to the particular cultures that have the creation myths and so on, but it just strikes me that this is a bit of a reach, and it doesn't seem to be a charitable interpretation of the video itself. And it just doesn't even strike me as a plausible interpretation. They just weren't even equating those things, but at least by my lights. Now again, Trent, maybe things strike Trent differently, but
you could easily do the same with atheism if you were uncharitable. You could equate atheism with a primitive myth about some kind of matter or causal force always existing. I'm not saying...
Yeah, so the thing is, they weren't equating the Kalam cosmological argument or religious philosophy and so on with those ancient myths. The ancient myths, if you actually watched the beginning of the documentary, were contrasted not with the Kalam cosmological argument, but they directly went on to go and contrast that with the contemporary view of the quote-unquote origins of our local spatio-temporal manifold, our particular universe. That is not saying that the Kalam cosmological argument is equated with or relevantly similar to these ancient myths. That's simply not what they were doing.
He's trying to do that, but it could come off that way.
It could come off that way. Okay, so I like that Trent made this kind of hedge here, but if all you're saying is that, oh, well, it could come off that way, I don't know, that just seems to me it's not worth including in the video then, if it's just, it might possibly strike someone that this is the case, when, firstly, to me, it just strikes me as clearly false that that's what's coming across, and also, secondly, this would be, if Trent were to mount this as an interpretation of the video, it would be an uncharitable interpretation of the video, so I just don't see the purpose of including this.
Second, in Craig's original 1979 book, The Kalam Cosmological Argument, he doesn't consider Big Bang cosmology to be the primary evidence for the beginning of the universe.
One thing that I will say is that it doesn't, I'd have to go back and listen to it, which I'm not going to, but they didn't claim that it was the primary evidence for the beginning of the universe, right? All they said is that people like William Lane Craig have latched onto this scientific evidence concerning the Big Bang and employed that in their case from the Kalam cosmological argument for God's existence. No one was intimating or suggesting or implying that this was the main thing that was doing the heavy lifting with respect to the Kalam cosmological argument. So again, this doesn't strike me as even relevant.
His argument is mostly based just on philosophy and the impossibility of the infinite past. He says Big Bang cosmology empirically confirms his philosophical argument. So some of the science he relies on in the 1979 book, it's a little outdated, but as we'll see, Craig has kept up with developments in cosmology since that time.
Okay, so I think he might have been responding there to their point that a particular interpretation of the Big Bang as an absolute origin of all of physical reality is outdated, and maybe Trent is saying, oh, well, Craig has kept up with the literature as it's been growing and growing. So maybe that's what he was responding to there, I'm not sure, but let's just continue.
In this film, we'll hear why this argument fails from the very cosmologists quoted by Kalam's supporters. And we'll also hear from leading philosophers of mathematics who will show why the concept of an infinite universe, now being proposed by many physicists, is perfectly coherent. And lastly, we'll see that if the universe did begin, it may not need a cause. The argument is often expressed like this. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause, and that cause is taken to be God. Let's start at the beginning. Philosophers like Craig have argued that the past must be finite.
If the universe never began to exist, that means that the number of past events in the history of the universe is infinite. But mathematicians recognize that the existence of an actually infinite number of things leads to self-contradictions.
As we shall see, contemporary mathematicians do not think infinity is contradictory.
And Craig doesn't think infinity is contradictory either.
All right, so one quick thing that I just want to say here is that when Craig said what he said in that clip, I think he was being potentially misleading. Not, I'm saying intentionally misleading, but potentially misleading, okay? Potentially misleading in the sense of, he said that an actual infinite number of things is self-contradictory or leads to self-contradiction. And that, of course, implies that an actual infinite number of things is contradictory. But importantly, though, in Craig's other work, he emphasizes that, well, really what he's saying is that they're metaphysically impossible. They are absurd. They're so counterintuitive so as to justify us in saying that they are metaphysically impossible. But given that this is his real or true stance on the matter, on whether or not, or on the nature of an actual infinite, namely it's being metaphysically impossible and absurd and not strictly logically contradictory, it does seem potentially misleading to say that an actual infinity leads to self-contradiction. Contradiction is pretty well nigh universally understood as something of the form P and not P. You're saying that of one proposition, of one claim, that it is both true and false, or that it is both true and not true.
that's pretty well nigh universally understood as what contradictory means. What Craig really should have said in the clip was that it's absurd or metaphysically impossible. Now, Craig clarifies this in Craig's published work, so that's perfectly fine and dandy. But what I think that the Scott I. Phil documentary was just highlighting there is just that there really isn't a strict logical contradiction in these sorts of things that Craig is focused on, and both Craig and mathematicians admit that. And so it's at least potentially misleading for Craig to say self-contradictory in the clip that they played. Instead, Craig should have said something like metaphysically absurd or metaphysically impossible. But anyway, let's continue listening to Trent.
In his reply to atheist J.H. Sobel, Craig says, "We can have comparable infinite multiplicities in mathematics without admitting them into our ontology." Now, this echoes other mathematicians who make a distinction between infinity existing in the abstract mathematical sense, which is possible, and infinity existing in the concrete physical world, the concrete sense, which for actual infinities is not possible. I'll give you some examples.
Right, so I mean, we should note that this is not an unbiased characterization of the distinction there. He's just saying that they are impossible. I know he's potentially going to go on to argue for that, but just in terms of articulating the distinction there, we shouldn't build into the case that one of them is impossible, whereas the other one is entirely possible. That's monumentally contested, and as far as I can tell, not a majority position in the philosophical literature. But that's just a note. It's not necessarily a big criticism. I'm not saying that Trent was trying to give a biased characterization of it. He's just explicating the difference there in terms of Trent's own view of whether or not they're possible. So again, I'm not really criticizing Trent in that regard, but I just wanted to make this note just in case the uninformed listener might think that, oh yeah, this is just an uncontroversial characterization of the distinction as philosophers and mathematicians understand it. It's not.
According to the mathematicians Edward Kasner and James Newman, they write, "The infinite certainly does not exist in the same way that we say there are fish in the sea. Existence in the mathematical sense is wholly different from the existence of objects in the physical world."
Right, so one thing that I want to say in this regard is like, okay, so two mathematicians have a particular view on this matter. Okay. That doesn't prove anything. I mean, this is a mere assertion. It doesn't show anything. I can equally quote other mathematicians who disagree with this. Another thing that's important to see is that, well, existing in the same sense, like, it's not even clear to me what that means. Like, what does it mean to say it doesn't even exist in the same sense? There are fish, yeah, and there are numbers. Both of them are in reality. Things are true of them, right? The number of fish is greater than 0. The number of numbers is greater than 0. That's all that we're saying when we're saying that they exist. We're saying that there are such things, that they're in reality, that we can truthfully predicate things of them, and so on. And so, yes, they have wildly different properties, right? So fish are concrete, they have causal powers, numbers are abstract, they don't have causal powers, and so on. Numbers don't have size or shape or color, whereas fish have size or shape or color. So they have radically different properties, but that's entirely different from saying that they exist in different senses. I find that implausible, and indeed, ontological monists, people who think that there is only one way that things exist, only one mode of being instead of multiple ways of being, are going to reject this claim that things exist in different senses. You could see my discussion with Trent Merrick's on a particularly powerful argument against ontological pluralism and in favor of ontological monism here. But anyway, my point here is not really about ontological pluralism and monism. My point is mainly just that this is a flat assertion. It doesn't really mean much if you're just quoting mathematicians who hold really contentious views. I could equally quote other mathematicians who make unsubstantiated assertions for the contrary view. So,
existence in the mathematical sense is wholly different from the existence of objects in the physical world. Likewise, the atheistic mathematician James Lindsay writes, "Infinity is an abstract concept made and existing only in the minds of those who can imagine it. Indeed, this is the mainstream interpretation of infinity among mathematicians."
So once again, it's just an assertion from this dude, this guy, this one mathematician, or whatever, right? Other mathematicians say other things, right? And you can assert that this is the mainstream interpretation of infinity among mathematicians, but we need some actual empirical evidence for that. And, well, frankly, I'm too lazy to go through this ... infinity plus God equals folly to see if he actually gives a citation of that, or rather a reference to something else that substantiates that claim. But at least from the armchair and from the mathematicians that I know of and speak to, I actually get a distinctively different sense of what they think. They tend to think that they're actually studying real, objective, mind-independent things, right? They think that they're discovering truths about numbers. When Euclid showed that there are infinitely many prime numbers, right? This isn't a truth that's dependent on our minds or existing only in our minds or something along those lines. No, mathematicians instead are discovering real features of the number line and numbers and functions and shapes and so on. These there seem to be objective mathematical truths. They seem to be necessary. There seem to be infinitely many of them and so on. And so they couldn't depend merely on our finite intellects and so on, right? If you ask a mathematician how many numbers there are, the mathematician is probably going to say there are infinitely many. What does that tell us? Well, that tells us they probably don't think that numbers solely exist in our minds alone, because there are infinitely many distinct numbers, but you can't identify that with infinitely many distinct things in our minds, right? Our minds are finite. They're not infinitely capacious. And so we wouldn't be able to have, like, let's say, infinitely many concepts with which numbers could be identified. Moreover, that would mean that, let's say, 1 plus 1 didn't equal 2 before humans came onto the scene, right? Because the numbers 1 and 2 didn't even exist until our concepts and so on came about. And so there are lots of really implausible implications of saying, for instance, that lots of these mathematical truths and mathematical objects and the domain of mathematical inquiry just depends on our minds, and they only exist in our minds. And so if I'm right about this, that actually the mainstream interpretation of mathematics more generally is a kind of realist or objectivist approach among mathematicians, well, then it's going to be simply false that this, namely infinity being an abstract concept made and existing only in our minds, it's going to be false that that is the mainstream interpretation of infinity among mathematicians. Because if the mainstream interpretation of mathematics more generally among mathematicians is objectivist and realist and so on, well then it's likewise a mainstream interpretation among mathematicians that there are infinitely many natural numbers, objectively and independently of our minds. And that, of course, entails that infinity itself is not, according to the mainstream view, an abstract concept made and existing only in our minds, because rather, there are infinitely many, and hence infinity, there are infinitely many natural numbers, or prime numbers, or whatever, that are objective, mind-independent, existing apart from us. And so infinity would not just be some kind of abstract concept that depends on our minds. No, there are actually, in reality, independently of us, an infinite number of things. And so infinity itself wouldn't just be some kind of concept, or at least according to the mainstream interpretation of infinity. But anyway, we don't need to worry about that too much. I just wanted to rebut this unsubstantiated flat assertion here, with some reasons to think that this unsubstantiated flat assertion is actually false after all. But let's continue.
Although it's true that philosophers of the past were troubled by it, but even they did not banish the concept. For example, Aristotle distinguished between different types of infinity.
The distinction that he was drawing was between an infinity that's present all at once, all at some particular point in time, which is what he meant by an actual infinity, contrasted with an infinity that is spread out over time, which is what he called a potential infinity. So, for example, if space were infinitely big, that would be an example of an actual infinity, because the whole of space is there at any given point in time. On the other hand, if you imagine a clock endlessly ticking, the ticks might go on forever, but if they did, that would be an example of a potential infinity.
The universe could also be infinite.
Okay, let me say something, because this is actually something that I disagreed with the Skydive Phil documentary. Aristotle, so they did correctly characterize Aristotle's view, but they didn't emphasize that as it's used, as the distinction between actual and potential infinity is used in contemporary discussions, it markedly and significantly differs from how Aristotle used it. According to Aristotle, an actual infinity is a simultaneously existing collection whose members are infinitely many, greater than any finite number. So it's a simultaneously existing collection, an actually infinite collection. By contrast, for Aristotle, a potential infinity is such that at any particular point in time, you don't have an actual infinite collection, but spread out over time, you have infinitely many things spread out over time, let's say. Or in space, you could have a potential infinite divisibility of something, right? So spread out over space or time, that's what Aristotle would think of as a potential infinity. Crucially, though, that's different from how contemporary discussions treat actual and potential infinites. One way you can see this is that for Aristotle, an infinite past is actually a potential infinite because it's spread out over time. At no particular point in time do you have infinitely many days, right? So the quote-unquote actually infinite past, that wouldn't make any sense to Aristotle. That is a potential infinite for Aristotle. It is spread out over time. It's not true that you have an actually infinite number of things simultaneously existing at one particular point in time. Aristotle, after all, believed in an actually infinite past, and Aristotle actually believed in an infinite past, right, a beginningless past, but he also believed that actual infinites are not possible. And so what this tells us, and Aristotle himself says this, commits to it, what this tells us is that for Aristotle, an infinite past would be merely a potential infinite. That's kind of weird, because in contemporary discussions, that's not how actual and potential infinites are used. And the Skydive Phil documentary should have made this explicit, and it is a big failing on the part of the documentary that it didn't make this explicit. In contemporary discussions, the actual potential infinite divide is distinguished in the following manner. An actual infinite is a collection whose members can be put in a one-to-one correspondence with the set of the natural numbers. In other words, an actual infinite is a set, the number of whose elements, or a collection, the number of whose elements or members is infinite. Okay? The quantity or number is aleph-null. It's infinity. It's greater than any natural number. By contrast, a potential infinity, as it's used in contemporary understandings, is a collection whose members, the number of whose members is always finite, but increasing without end, increasing without bound or limit. Okay? That's the distinction as it's used in a contemporary philosophical setting. Importantly, once you see this, right, an infinite past would actually count as an actual infinite. Contrary to how it would be classified under Aristotle's view, an infinite past would count as an actual infinite under this particular contemporary understanding of the actual potential infinite divide, because the collection of past events would be equinumerous with the natural numbers. That is, there would be infinitely many members of that set, the collection of past events. Similarly, an endless future, under this contemporary definition, would also count as an actual infinite, because the set of events, each of which is such that it will happen, is aleph-null. The number of those elements is aleph-null, right? There are infinitely many events, each of which is such that it will happen. Note that I'm not saying each of which is such that it will have happened, right? Again, yeah, pick any arbitrary point in the future, only finitely many only finitely many events will have happened, and that is going to be increasing without bound and always finite. But we're talking about the number of future events themselves, okay? And if the future is endless, that is, it doesn't come to an end, it goes on and on and on and on and on without end, well then the number of future events, each of which is such that it will happen, is infinite. Suppose that it were finite. Suppose that the number of events, each of which is such that it will happen, suppose that were finite. Well, then the future would actually come to an end, right? Suppose the number were like 312, right? There are 312 events, or let's just say days to make it easier. Suppose the number of days, each of which is such that it will happen, is 312. Well, then in 312 days, time is going to end, right? Time is going to come to an end. Because if it didn't come to an end, if it went on for another day, well, then it's actually false today that the number of days, each of which is such that it will happen, was 312. In fact, it was actually 313. And so, if the number of days, each of which is such that it will happen, were finite, well, then the future would come to an end. But we're supposing that the future is endless, and hence the number of events, or number of days, each of which is such that it will happen, is infinite. And so, under the contemporary understanding of the distinction between a potential and actual infinite, both the collection of past events and the collection of future events, if the past is beginningless and if the future is endless, both of those will count as an actual infinite. Again, because the collection is such that the number of its elements is aleph-null. There are infinitely many such elements. Now, there's actually been a lot of confusion online with people thinking that an endless future, even given the contemporary understanding, would not count as an actual infinite. So I just want to read some stuff that allays that puts that to rest, because that is confused. This post that I'm looking at here is from Use of Reason. It's Alex Malpass's blog, and it's based on his paper published in the Philosophical Quarterly, one of the best philosophy journals in the world. And it's actually available right here if you click it, where what they do is they point out that given the contemporary understanding of an actual and potential infinite, the future does in fact count as an actual infinite. Just read that paper, they explain it brilliantly. But Alex also explains it in this video, so that's really essentially what we're going to be doing. So, and in this particular blog post, Alex was focused on reflections on his discussion with William Lane Craig, but we are going to be using it to illustrate the point that I was just making, because some people in the audience might not be down with it, even though they should. But that's what I'm going to try to get them onto. So anyway, the issue is whether the Hilbert's Hotel argument, which is supposed to show that the past must have a beginning, can be used to show that the future must have an end. In their paper, Endless and Infinite, Malpass and Morriston give a symmetry argument, which is just a Hilbert's Hotel argument, but retensed so that it's about the future, not the past. So they think, and I think they're obviously right about this, that the situation is perfectly symmetrical. If the past had no beginning, well then the number of past events, the number of past days if you like, will be equal to the cardinality of the natural numbers. You could assign each one a unique number and have none left unassigned. Having this property makes it an actual infinite for Craig, or at least having this property makes it problematic for Craig. The quote-unquote actual infinite is the problematic one for Craig. The thing is that this cardinality behaves weirdly, as it can have proper parts that are equivalent to the whole. Craig brings this out with his Hilbert's Hotel examples, each of which involves things like there being both more guests and also the same number of guests after a new guest checks into the hotel, etc. This is too much for Craig, who says that this shows that anything actually infinite cannot exist concretely in reality, in the same sort of way as hotels or library books. Given that there would be just as many, say, past even days as the total number of past days, the beginningless past has the problematic property that got Hilbert's Hotel into trouble. Thus, the past must be finite, or so his argument goes. All they point out in the paper, though, is that this property applies to future events just as much as past ones. If the future never ends, then the number of future events, the number of future days, if you like, will be equal to the cardinality of the natural numbers. You could assign each one a unique natural number, and have none left unassigned. As each day passes, there is the same number of days left to go as there was previously. As such, the endless future is just as similar to Hilbert's Hotel as the beginningless past. There is a very obvious, at least prima facie, symmetry here. If you accept that Hilbert's Hotel is intolerably absurd, such that nothing having that property could exist, namely that Cantorian property where you can have a one-to-one correspondence between a whole set and one of its proper subsets or proper parts, well then this bars the beginningless past and the endless future equally. This is the symmetry argument in a nutshell. But this is quite tricky if you want to hold, like Craig does, that the endless future is possible, but the beginningless past is not. And Christianity is committed to the endless future being possible, which I think means that they can't run the Hilbert's Hotel argument. At least if you also hold that the reason to think that the beginningless past is impossible is because of these Hilbert's Hotel-style examples. Such a person needs to provide some kind of symmetry breaker according to which the past and future can be treated differently with respect to Hilbert's Hotel argument. Now, in their paper, they systematically go through basically any potential symmetry breaker that you might think of, and as well as all the ones that Craig has proposed in the literature, and they explain why each one is insufficient. The first was his central claim, which is that the beginningless past is an actual infinite, but the endless future is merely a potential infinite. The second is that there are no future events at all. The third is that the future is pure potentialities, etc. You can read it for yourself to see all the details, and I highly recommend you do that because they do a really good job of systematically critiquing each of these suggestions. Alex Malpass thinks that all of Craig's symmetry breakers obviously fail, and I join him in that, given that I've read their paper there. And in particular, the potential versus actual infinite I consider to be completely dead as a response to this question. Anyway, this was the context for the discussion between Craig and Malpass. Now, what Malpass does in this article is he considers Craig's quote-unquote 5-point reply, and the first point is not relevant for present purposes, so we're just going to go to the second point. So in the second point, Craig gives a proposal for a symmetry breaker, saying it is plausible that the past and future series of events are not perfectly symmetrical. He continues saying that on a tense theory of time, according to which temporal becoming is an objective feature of reality, there are no events later than the present event, and hence no future events. So a tense theory of time entails that an actually infinite number of future events does not exist. Indeed, the number of future events is 0. But this is exactly one of the symmetry breakers that Wes and Alex addressed in their paper. It's as if he didn't read what they put. As they pointed out in the paper, the idea that there are no future events on a tense theory of time is ambiguous, and when disambiguating, Craig himself shows why this isn't a symmetry breaker. What Alex means is that we need to distinguish between how many future events there are and how many future events there will be. Fair enough, a presentist wants to deny that any non-present events exist. So for them, there are no future events. However, even a presentist wants to say that there will be future events, unless she thinks that she's at the very final moment of time, which is obviously not what someone like Craig, who thinks that time doesn't have an end, would want to say. And as they pointed out in the paper, Craig himself makes this distinction in print. Consider the following lines. Thus, there really are no past or future events, except in the sense that there have been certain events and there will be certain others. It's all good to say that for a presentist there are no future events, but if you think that there will be future events, as Craig does, then the question becomes, how many future events will there be if the future is endless? Given the distinction, it is no good to try to claim that the answer is still 0, because that means that time is coming to an end right now, and isn't just the innocent presentist commitment to no non-present events. So this part of the response just feels a step behind the dialectic. Craig already made this point, and we already responded to it. Craig is just repeating the point, not engaging with our response. He isn't explaining how the disambiguation doesn't apply, or how it does apply, but the answer is still 0, or anything like that. He's just not engaging. He goes on to develop this point and brings up what I think is a different symmetry breaker, but which Wes and I also extensively engage with in our paper. Now, I should also note that something that Malpass doesn't say in this particular blog post is that, yes, also, given presentism, the number of future events is 0, but also given presentism, the number of past events is also 0, right? Past events don't exist. There are no such things, right? If this is what you're saying about the future, that future events don't exist, and so their number is 0, well, under presentism, past events don't exist, and so their number is 0 as well. Now, the reason, and so Craig wouldn't be able to claim that the past is an actual infinite in that case. Now, the way to get around this is saying, oh no, we're talking about how many events did happen, right? We're talking about how many events did happen, and that is actually infinite. Yes, but that's literally the same thing that we're talking about in the future, the number of future events that will happen, and that is obviously aleph-null. That's obviously infinity if the future is endless. We have a collection here which is such that its members can be paired in a one-to-one correspondence with the natural numbers, and hence is actually infinite. So let's go back. So this is, Craig brings up what Malpass thinks is a different symmetry breaker, but which Wes and Malpass also extensively engage with in their paper. So Craig says the series of events later than any event in time, including the initial cosmological singularity, is always finite and always increasing toward infinity as a limit. In other words, such a series is potentially infinite. Georg Cantor called the potential infinite a variable finite. If the series of future events is potentially infinite, then the series of future events is finite but endless. This is a somewhat obscure notion, but can be made totally clear. He is saying that the series of events later than any event in time is always finite and always increasing toward infinity as a limit. But this is just wrong. Consider a mundane case. Suppose I'm going to count from 1 to 10. Before I start, how many future counting events will there be? The answer is obviously 10. Now suppose I've already counted 5 numbers. How many future counting events are there now? The answer is 5. I've counted 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and I still have 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 to go. So the amount of future counting events might be finite. So the amount of future counting events is finite, but it's not increasing over time. It's clearly decreasing. Suppose an angel starts counting now and never stops, and that time is endless. How many numbers will she count? Well, at the start of her count, she has all the natural numbers left to count. So, aleph-null many numbers left to count. But after she has counted, say, 5 numbers, she still has aleph-null many numbers left to count. The amount of numbers left to count is neither increasing nor decreasing, but staying exactly the same. In a very straightforward way, then, when the future is endless, the quote-unquote series of events later than any event in time is not always finite and always increasing toward infinity as a limit, as Craig claimed. Rather, it is never finite and remains the same size forever. In short, it is not a potential infinity at all, but an actual infinity. How come Craig sees things so differently? Well, it has to do with the weird way that Craig is using the term the future. In his paper with Sinclair, he puts it like this. For as a result of the arrow of time, the series of events later than any arbitrarily selected past event is properly to be regarded as a limit. We are looking at the quote-unquote events later than any arbitrarily selected past event. Why this, and not just events in the future of the present? Well, it's because if you look at it like this, then you get something that is much more like a potential infinite, that is, always finite but ever increasing, etc. Consider the following picture, which visualizes what Craig is saying, right? We have a first moment, we have an arbitrarily selected past event, and then we have right now, right? And yes, it is always going to be the case that between the moving now and an arbitrarily selected past event, it's only going to be the case that some finite amount of time elapses. And as the now progresses, this is increasing without bound. If we think about the length of the interval marked some finite amount, then obviously it is only finitely long. Now imagine that the point marked now slides off towards the right as time passes. Clearly, the interval between it and the arbitrarily selected past event is going to increase but never be anything other than finite. This is obviously what Craig has in mind when he says that the future is a potential infinite. But this is where the distinction between the simple future tense and the future perfect tense comes in. Notice that the interval in question is always behind the now point. It marks the bit between a past event and the present. It is as if we are at the arbitrary past point and wondering how much time will have passed as of some future point. The answer to this question is that it is always finite, but ever increasing as time passes. And I totally agree that this is a potential and not actual infinite. Totally. But the thing that cannot be ignored is that we are not talking about the simple number of future events anymore. We are talking about how many days will be passed in the future. That's super obviously not the same thing, right? As Wes and Alex Malpass put it in the paper, that simply isn't an answer to the question of how many events will there be. It is just to answer a different question. Again, by simply repeating this line, rather than responding to the extensive critique offered in the paper, Craig seems to be one step behind the dialectic. So far, point 2 merely repeats Craig's positions without interacting with the critiques of them. Again, it's not really a response. It's a thing that they originally responded to and which still stands without a response. Craig ends this section with the following. The crucial thing to see here is that if the future is endless, the number of events, each of which is such that it will occur, is actually infinite. There is an infinite number of events, each of which is such that it will occur, right? Think again about the case of an angel that's counting. How many numbers, each of which are such that they will be counted? How many numbers? Are there, each of which is such that it will be counted? Well, obviously, infinitely many, right? If you said only finitely many, let's say you said 140, well, then you're saying that only 140 numbers are such that they will be counted. Well, that means that the angel is going to stop counting once the angel gets up to 140, right? If the angel didn't stop counting, well, then they'd count up to 141, and then 142, and then 143, in which case it was false when you said that the number of numbers, each of which is such that it will be counted by the angel, was 140. Actually, it's greater than that. And so what this tells us is that the only thing that's potentially infinite here is the distance, as it were, the temporal distance between some arbitrarily selected past event and the moving now. Yes, as the now progresses, right, as time progresses, the distance between some arbitrarily selected past point and the progressing now, that's always finite and that's always increasing. But that's not the collection that we're talking about. The collection that we're talking about is the number of future events, each of which is such that it will happen. And that's not from here to here, rather, that's from here and on, right? And there are obviously infinitely many events, or we could say days if you like, that makes it simpler. It's obvious that there are going to be infinitely many days, each of which is such that it will be actual, okay? And what this tells us is that the future is a collection, the number of whose elements is aleph-null, in which case it's an actual infinite. Now you might say, oh no, the future isn't actual. Yes, but then you could say the same thing about the past. Under Craig's view, right, the past isn't actual. It doesn't exist. Oh, well then you might say, oh, but the past has been actual, right? It has been actualized. Yeah, but you could say the exact same thing about the future. It will be actualized. Again, you have a perfect symmetry here. Anyway, check out the paper, the endless and infinite paper. But I just wanted to include this because I think it's so crystal clear that an endless future is not a potential infinite. The only thing that's a potential infinite is the distance between the moving now and an arbitrarily selected point on the timeline, which is either before now or now. That, yes, that is a potential infinite, and that seems to be what people have in mind when they say that an endless future is a potential infinite. Yes, the moving spotlight, as it were, if we want to think of it like that, but the moving now, as time progresses, is increasing, and the distance between that moving now and some arbitrarily selected past event is finite, right? It's always finite. That's never infinite. You'll never have an infinite distance between the moving now and some arbitrarily selected past event. But that's just not that's changing the subject. That's not the collection that we were talking about. We were talking about the number of days or the number of events from a given point, each of which is such that it will happen. So we're just looking out into the future. And if this thing is endless, well then it is simply obvious that the number of future events is going to be aleph-null. Just think about the number line. If this is 0, this is the origin, and then this is going all the way out there, well, the number of positive integers there is going to be aleph-null. And similarly, if the future is indeed determinately endless, such that each of these days will in fact happen, well then the number of days which will happen is aleph-null. This is crystal clear. So the endless future is an actual infinite. And if you want to say that actual infinites are metaphysically impossible, then you're going to have to say an endless future is metaphysically impossible. And since Christianity entails that an endless future is indeed possible, in fact it's actual, well then you're going to have to give up Christianity along with it. And notice that an endless future has all the same quote-unquote absurd properties that Craig and others who dislike the actual infinite is alleged to have. You can do all the same manipulations and subtractions and so on if you have an endless future. And so if those are metaphysically impossible, if those are quote-unquote absurd, well then you're going to have to say that the future cannot be endless. Consider, for instance, that if the future could be endless, well then it could be the case that there is, let's say, an angel that starts counting today and that never stops counting. Okay, then we can ask how many numbers are such that, from the perspective of today, how many numbers are such that they will be counted? So at some point in the future, they will be counted. How many numbers? Well, obviously, infinitely many. Every single natural number is eventually going to be said. So it is true of every natural number that it will be said, and hence there are infinitely many numbers, each of which is such that it will be said. But now, suppose that, God is just getting really annoyed with this angel just saying numbers 1, 2, 3, just regularly every single day. And so God just wants God wants to have a day off, that he doesn't have to listen to this angel just counting monotonously, okay? So God's getting pretty mad at this angel, and or God's getting mad that this angel is planning this sort of thing, and maybe in a nearby possible world does this sort of thing. And so God is like, okay, listen, angel, before you embark on this task, I'm going to pay you $2 million to just take a day off in between these, okay? It's really annoying, and, I'm too busy drowning the earth and, killing babies and things like that. Okay, sorry, I shouldn't have included that, but I'm too busy slaughtering Canaanites and, commanding genocide, but, no, God is saying, like, listen, it's just really annoying, this incessant chanting of this number. So just take a day off in between these, okay? So say 1 on the first day, but then take a day off. I need a rest. And then say 2 the next day. And then take a day off, and then say 3, and so on ad infinitum. Or, alternatively, here's what you could do. You could say, so again, this is God speaking to the angel. This is what you could do. You could say 1 the first day, and then the second day, just say 2 in your mind, okay? Please, just say that in your mind. Don't say it out loud. And then you can say 3 the next day out loud. And then 4, say that in your mind. So for every even number, say that in your mind, please. Don't say that out loud. But for the rest of them, yeah, you can say those out loud. Now, notice that what happens when we go from the original scenario of the angel saying every single number out loud along each day of the endless future, in this second scenario, the angel is only saying the odd numbers out loud. Okay? So we have gone from one situation, we have infinitely many numbers, each of which is such that it will be said by the angel. And then what we do is we subtract, right? We take out the odd-numbered singing events, right? The angel is singing numbers or saying the numbers or chanting the numbers or whatever. We take out infinitely many of those, right? Because the angel's just going to say them in their head, right? And so in this next scenario, we take out infinitely many of them, but we still have infinitely many singing events, each of which is such that it will happen, right? Because the angel is going to be saying the number 1 and the number 3 and then the number 5 and then the number 7 and so on. Originally, the angel was going to be singing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, but now they're only singing out loud the odd numbers. And so we go from an infinite number, an infinite collection, namely the collection of numbers, each of which is such that the angel will sing it aloud, and we go from that to a situation by subtracting infinitely many, and yet we still have infinity, right? We still have infinitely many in the collection of numbers, each of which is such that the angel will sing. And so infinity minus infinity is infinity. You get that as a result. You get these infinite subtractions as a result of an endless future. Now suppose that, God is just, he's so fed up with it at some point that he's just like, you know what? Although I said originally that you could plan to do this endlessly, you're just going to have to stop tomorrow, okay? I'm done with this. So he cuts off the angel the next day. In that case, yet again, we have another infinite subtraction, right? We are taking out all the natural numbers that will be said after a given finite natural number. And so the angel only sings finitely many natural numbers. And so we've done yet another infinite subtraction from an infinite set. And we've gotten a finite number. Oh, infinity minus infinity is infinity. And also infinity minus infinity is a finite number. Absurd. And so what we get from this quote-unquote absurdity is that the future cannot be endless. Because the future could be endless, we could do all these absurd manipulations and subtractions of events that will occur in the future. You could do every odd-numbered event or all the events and so on. You could do all these subtractions. That is entailed by the possibility of an endless future. And since those are allegedly absurd, you can conclude that the future cannot obtain, the endless future cannot obtain, if we assume that all these things are quote-unquote absurd and metaphysically impossible, which I don't think we should. But again, defenders of Hilbert's Hotel, like William Lane Craig and like Trent Horn and so on, it seems as though they are just going to have to be committed to the impossibility of an endless future. And that means that they're just going to have to be committed to denying Christianity. Christianity is false, because Christianity entails that the future is endless. We have an endless afterlife. And so it seems as though they have a choice. Either they give up this argument or they give up Christianity. I think they should quite clearly give up this argument, but, Anyway, if you want to look into all this stuff further, I highly, highly, highly recommend checking out the Endless and Infinite paper linked here, and I will link that in the description of this video. I've also discussed that paper with Alex Malpass in a lot of the videos in my Kalam playlist. But anyway, back to the Rebutting an Atheistic documentary. So, yeah, let's continue.
Infinitely large in the sense that it's forever expanding, and so it will grow in size forever. But overall, this is a helpful distinction. Another way to put it is to note that there are an infinite number of points between you and the door of a room, but you can reach the door because the points get smaller and smaller as they're potentially divided.
So, this is a little bit imprecisely stated, right? Points can't be divided, right? Points don't have extension. They're points. So you can't divide a point. You can't have like a half of a point, right? That doesn't make any sense. You can't divide points. So, but maybe he just means distances, right? So like there are, in some sense, if we think that space is continuous, there are infinitely many extended distances between his arm and the door, right? You can consider the first half of that distance, maybe it's 2 feet, and then you can consider the next quarter, and then the next eighth, and then the next 1/16th, and so on. So yeah, I guess in that sense, maybe that's what he's thinking, that there are those distances. But importantly, though, if time is continuous, right, those distances are actual. They actually exist, because time and space, as we're assuming here, would be continuous. So there are actually those infinitely many distances there. Now, you're going to have to deny, then, the continuity of time. You're going to have to think, and space, you're going to have to think either space and time are discrete, or else you could take an intermediate view, which would be a kind of, perhaps an Aristotelian view, where you think that whole distances and whole times are ontologically prior to divisions that you might make of them. And so the divisions that you might make of them really only exist potentially. They don't actually exist. Instead, what really actually exists is just the whole, and the parts, in some sense, exist only once you kind of divvy the space up, and that you, etc. So that's a kind of odd intermediate view, but it's a conceptual possibility that they might take. My point here is just making a clarification on what Trent said, and he's actually going to have to commit himself to some pretty controversial theses in the philosophy of space and the philosophy of time that many philosophers think are just false, and that actually a lot of our best scientific theories treat time and space as continuous, which is an interesting result. But again, I'm not claiming that space and time are continuous. The debate there is huge, and you could give anti-realist interpretations of such theories and so on. But anyway, we're just going to continue. I just wanted to make that clarification because he was speaking of points being able to be divided or whatever, but that doesn't make any sense.
Door of a room, but you can reach the door because the points get smaller and smaller as they're potentially divided. This is a potential infinite. But if you had to walk
See, also, like, it just depends upon your view of space and time, because there actually are, if space is continuous, there actually are infinitely many points, indeed continuum many. That's an even larger cardinal infinite than just the infinite of the natural numbers. There actually are those points, right? You can specify a point that's, let's say, 0.1 inches away from you, and then 0.11 inches away from you, and then 0.111 inches away from you, and then 0.11111 inches away from you. All those points are going to be there if space is continuous, and so you actually are going to have an actual infinite number of points between you and that door. But again, he's probably just going to reject that space is continuous, which, okay, that's a pretty controversial view, but that's fine if he wants to reject that.
across an actually infinite number of tiles that were the same size, you could never reach the door, because that's an actual infinite. As we continue, you'll see that while reality can make room for the potentially infinite, it can't do the same for actually infinite collections of discrete things. And this forms the foundation for Craig's objection that the past cannot be infinite.
But in the 19th century, Georg Cantor revolutionized the mathematics of the infinite.
What Cantor achieved was to treat infinity as a subject of mathematics itself.
It was a whole new branch of mathematics, and it was of breathtaking ingenuity, showed incredible craftsmanship and creativity on Cantor's part.
What Cantor showed was that an infinite set has a strange feature. We might call this the infinite property.
Okay, now note that different people call this property in different terms, right? So Alex Malpass and I, we like to call it Cantor's property. In the video series that I'm doing with Stephen Woodford, or Rationality Rules, we are calling it Cantor's property. But yeah, you can also call it the infinite property, whatever. But yeah, as they're about to explain, the property is just that for an infinite collection or an infinite set, you can pair a proper subset of the set. You can pair that proper subset, all of its members, with the original set in a one-to-one correspondence. So they're going to explain that there. So
That is, it can be put into a one-to-one correspondence with a subset of itself.
We can.
well, no, okay, so it's a proper subset. That's really what they should have said, because obviously every set can be put into a one-to-one correspondence with a subset, because every set is a subset of itself. So this is another place where I would ever so gently criticize the Skydive Phil documentary. They should have said a proper subset.
That is, it can be put into a one-to-one correspondence with a subset of itself.
We can pair the even numbers up with all the numbers, all the counting numbers altogether. So 2 gets matched with 1, 4 gets matched with 2, 6 gets matched with 3, 8 gets matched with 4, etc., etc.
So, for instance, you can show that there are just as many even numbers as there are counting numbers, when intuition should tell you that there are half as many.
Well, okay, so this just is counterintuitive, and it's counterintuitive because we're used to dealing with finite sets, and what we have to say in the case of finite sets just doesn't carry over to the case of infinite sets. But it doesn't follow that there's anything incoherent about what we say in the infinite case. It just follows that we have to start saying different things in the infinite case.
Craig and other defenders.
All right, so I just switched locations from my room to the common area on our floor, so unfortunately the audio quality is not going to be as high as it previously was, but hopefully it's still comprehensible and intelligible. Anyway, my point in pausing here was just to say that the people on screen were saying that, yeah, hey, it might be unintuitive or counterintuitive or whatever. Now, for me, I just want to note that intuitions are going to vary a lot across different people here, depending on their background. So I know a lot of people who don't find Cantor's property unintuitive or counterintuitive at all. I also know a lot of people who do find it unintuitive or counterintuitive. I myself, I can just confess this to you. I don't find it counterintuitive or unintuitive in the slightest. Maybe that's just because I've grown up quite familiar with Cantorian set theory and so on. You know, I've been I'm a Gen Zer, I'm a Zoomer, so what that means is that from a very young age, I've been watching YouTube and listening to debates, and I've been surrounded by social media and so on, and of course being interested in math and science and philosophy and theology. Even from a very young age, I myself have been, I've watched math videos from a very young age and, learned about infinity and so on. And so I'm quite familiar with these sorts of things, and I've been for a very long time. And it just doesn't seem unintuitive to me at all. Of course there are equally as many natural numbers as there are even numbers, precisely because you can pair them into one-to-one correspondence with one another. Yeah, there might be some sense in which you skip one for every even number. The next one has the even number plus the odd number, but I don't see why it just doesn't strike me as intuitive that would thereby make it have more natural numbers in the sense of a greater cardinality, a greater size of the set, a greater number of elements within the set. In fact, when I reflect on the matter, I could just see that it's quite obvious that they have to have the same number of elements. And it just doesn't strike me as unintuitive at all, that a proper subset of a set could have the same number of elements as the set itself. So anyway, I just want to mention that people's intuitions differ, and so I myself don't even find it unintuitive at all, this property.
Craig and other defenders of the Kalam argument agree that when you deal with infinite sets, there are unusual properties, but it's all logically coherent. Here's what Craig writes. When it is alleged that an actual infinite cannot exist, the modality at issue is not strict logical possibility. Otherwise, the presumed strict logical consistency of axiomatic set theory would be enough to guarantee that the existence of an actual infinite is possible. Rather, what is at issue here is so-called metaphysical possibility, which has to do with some things being realizable or actualizable, end quote. And here's how Craig offered this reply in a debate with the atheistic physicist Lawrence Krauss, who makes a similar objection. I'll share Krauss's argument and then Craig's response.
So it wasn't clear to me that they were making an objection along the lines of, hey, it's perfectly consistent, and so it's entirely metaphysically possible, right? Rather, I think what they were saying is that, it might be slightly counterintuitive, or, they might have unusual properties, but why should we think that entails that they are metaphysically impossible, right? Quantum mechanics has lots of unintuitive aspects to it, and yet, clearly we don't think that the findings of quantum mechanics are metaphysically impossible. Platypuses, or platypi, have some unusual and unintuitive features, as it were. The subsistent act of being itself is extremely counterintuitive, at least by my lights, and yet Trent wants to affirm that there is such a thing, that there necessarily must be such a thing. So what I really think that they were doing in pointing out that, like, hey, this is perfectly coherent, it seems to me that really what they're getting at is that, hey, although it's slightly counterintuitive, or although it might be unintuitive, at least to some people, why should we conclude from that it is even metaphysically impossible in the first place? So, okay, what I would want to say is that if it strikes you as deeply intuitively possible that they are metaphysically impossible, then yes, you have some prima facie defeasible justification, because I accept something along the lines of something roughly like phenomenal conservatism. But for those who don't have the intuition, or for those who are possessed of other reasons for thinking that it's possible that you could have an actual infinite, like conceivability or arguments for realism about mathematical objects or other sorts of reasons, then that intuition could be defeated. And still other people might not even have the intuition that such things are metaphysically impossible, and so they won't thereby have defeasible justification for thinking that they're possible. So this is ultimately going to be an individual-specific enterprise. right? Justification is person-specific. It depends on your concoction of prior beliefs, experiences, intuitions, seemings, books you've read, people you've listened to, videos you've watched, and so on. But for me, I don't find it counterintuitive at all, and what I think that Malpass and the other philosopher were urging is just that why should we give so much assurance, as Craig does, to his intuitions here of the impossibility of actual infinites, given that they are entirely perfectly coherent, we have a worked out theory about them that's entirely consistent, and so on. That, I think, is the best way to understand their criticism, not as understanding their it doesn't seem to me a good way to understand their criticism as, oh, well, it's perfectly coherent, therefore it's metaphysically possible.
The atheistic physicist Lawrence Krauss, who makes a similar objection. I'll share Krauss's argument and then Craig's response.
The existence of infinity, which you talked about, which is self-contradictory, is not self-contradictory at all. Mathematicians know precisely how to deal with infinity, so do physicists. It's strange and very unappetizing, and in fact, you can sum things that look ridiculous. For example, if you sum the series 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5 plus 6 to infinity, what's the answer? Minus 112. You don't like it? Too bad. Here he says that the universe doesn't need to begin to exist because we know in mathematics how to deal with infinities. For example, how to sum infinities. Well, of course, in mathematics you can do that. Mathematics has certain conventions and rules that you use to prevent contradictions from occurring. For example, in transfinite arithmetic, the inverse operations of subtraction and division are prohibited because they lead to contradictions. But while you can slap the hand of the mathematician who tries to break the rules, if you've got, say, an infinite number of baseball cards, you can't stop for someone from giving away part of the cards. And so you will have contradictions when you translate it into reality. It may be possible on paper in the realm of mathematics, but it's not possible in the realm of reality.
So Craig would agree that
Importantly, though, none of those were contradictions, right? It's not a contradiction that if you have infinitely many guests, you can manipulate them in such a way that if you subtract infinitely many in one case, and then you subtract a different infinite set in another case, you can get different results from such subtractions. There's nothing contradictory about that unless you add a principle to the effect of, for any quantity whatsoever, whether finite or infinite, if you subtract an identical quantity from that quantity, then you must get an identical quantity as a result of that subtraction. That's the only way you can get a contradiction from that. But why the hell should we believe that principle, right? As far as I'm concerned, Craig merely flatly asserts that principle. Maybe Craig finds it intuitive. To me, it doesn't strike me as intuitive. And in fact, when I reflect on the nature of infinite subsets and different rearrangements that we can make with them, the principle strikes me as false, actually, because we have these cases that are entirely intelligible where the principle just breaks down. So to me, not only is the principle just flatly asserted with no justification whatsoever, it seems to me that we might actually have reason on the basis of infinity considerations to reject the principle. And moreover, it's not as though, again, there's nothing mysterious here about subtracting infinite quantities from infinite quantities to get divergent results, because the way that you're doing these subtractions differ, right? It would be quite weird if you subtracted identical quantities from identical quantities in an identical manner, in the same way, and yet got different results, right? That would seem to just be utterly inexplicable. There'd be nothing within the process that could explain why you got a different result in one case, whereas in the other one you got another result, right? Because ex hypothesi, the way by which you subtracted the quantities was exactly the same, and moreover, the quantities that you subtracted from and that you subtracted were exactly the same. But that's not what's happening in Hilbert's Hotel. Rather, we are subtracting in different ways. In one case, we take out all the people who are natural numbers 4 and above, say. In another case, we do a different way of subtracting and manipulating sets. Instead, we take out all the even-numbered members. Of course, you're going to be able to get out different results from that, right? There's nothing surprising, unintuitive, or whatever about that. So the only principle here that I would grant as intuitively obvious is one that if you are subtracting identical quantities from identical quantities in an identical manner, then you have to get an identical result. But that, of course, is not what we are doing in the case of Hilbert's Hotel and the manipulations of infinity. You are subtracting them in different ways. And of course, if you do the subtractions in different ways, it's quite clear that you're going to get different results, regardless of whether or not you are subtracting an identical quantity from an identical quantity. And although in certain axiomatizations and in certain versions of set theory and so on in piano arithmetic, you can't make sense of subtracting infinite sets from one another, this transfinite subtraction and so on, although that might not be well-defined in such systems, there are other systems for which we can make well-defined operations that are that are the operations being performed in these Hilbert-Totel thought experiments. Here is one such way that you can make this perfectly intelligible even from a mathematical perspective. Sure, we're not using the axioms of piano arithmetic and so on, but there are entirely different ways where you can make sense of quote-unquote subtraction of infinite collections from other infinite collections, even mathematically. And so you wouldn't have to slap the mathematician on the hand for breaking rules in this sense. And so we can model these subtractions in different ways that are that you could do mathematically. One way of doing this is what's called set difference, right? So set difference is a way of modifying a set by removing the elements belonging to another set. So subtraction of sets is indicated by either the symbols minus, that kind of minus sign, or this little backwards slash or whatever it's called, backslash. For example, a minus b can be written a minus b or a divided by b. I know it's a backslash, but whatever. Now, the way to understand this construction here is that you have a set A, and you take away the members of A that belong to B, and you get a resulting set, and that set is just A minus B, right? That is itself a set. And so, for instance, if A was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and B was 1, 2, 11, well then, the resulting set from A minus B would be 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It's all the members of A that are not members of B. So in some sense, you are taking out from A everything that A shares in common with B, okay? And so this is a perfectly intelligible notion of subtraction, and you can apply this to infinite sets, right? The infinite set of the natural numbers, so you could let that be A, and then you could subtract from that. You could take the set difference, and the B you can let, let's say, be the natural numbers. Excuse me, be the even natural numbers. So A is the natural numbers, B is the set of the even natural numbers. What's the resultant set? Well, obviously it's going to be the set which is the odd natural numbers. And you can make perfect sense of this. This is a kind of transfinite subtraction that you can make perfect sense of mathematically. All you need is some set theory and specify the sets in question, right? And then all you have to do is take every element in A that isn't also an element of B, and that's going to be your resultant set from the subtraction. So even if even if it's absurd, quote unquote absurd, or leads to different results in certain axiomatizations and certain understandings within certain systems within mathematics, that doesn't mean that that is being true of absolutely every mathematical system or absolutely every mathematical operation that we can define. Because this, I would argue, this set subtraction, this set difference is going to allow us to have perfectly coherent, cogent mathematical models on which you can subtract infinities from other infinities, so long as the infinities that we're talking about are sets. And so for me, Craig's point and Trent's point, it just seems neither here nor there, the fact that we have to prohibit or debar these sorts of transfinite subtractions, as it were, given certain mathematical systems and whatnot. That just seems neither here nor there, because there are other mathematical systems on which the sorts of subtractions that take place in concrete reality, in the Hilbert-Totel thing and so on, we can model those mathematically. We can have a sense in which we are doing transfinite subtraction, so long as we have different sets and we're taking the set difference. And so the fact that, it's just neither here nor there that, yes, like you can slap the mathematician on the hand and chide him for attempting to do transfinite subtraction given a certain system, mathematical system, and yet, you can't stop reality from making these sorts of subtractions. That's neither here nor there, because again, the mathematician can just move to a different system in which this kind of subtraction makes perfect sense. So anyway, let's go back to the video.
Dealing with infinite sets, it's coherent even if it's not familiar to us. The problem are the paradoxes that come up when you try to apply the infinite in specific cases in the real world. This point was made by the mathematician David Hilbert. We'll talk about him a little later. But he said, the role that remains for the infinite to play is solely that of an idea.
Again, I can quote people who disagree with that and who are equally competent and so on. So again, I'm not saying that Trent is trying to use these in support of a case, but it's just not clear what support they have other than mere rhetorical support. It's just a quote from a dude who thinks something, even though equally informed professionals in this field disagree with him. So
a little later. But he said, the role that remains for the infinite to play is solely that of an idea.
What you get from most mathematicians, I would say almost all mathematicians, is an uncritical acceptance of infinity in the sense of actual infinity. That's what they need for doing the kind of mathematics that they
So one of the first things that mathematicians come to appreciate is that infinite collections do have different properties from finite collections. Things that we absolutely take for granted in the finite case simply don't carry over to the infinite case. And if it's the finite case that is providing us with our basic intuitions, then that means that some of the results about infinite sets are going to be counterintuitive. But that's just what you would expect. Why should the finite and the infinite be the same? As long as we're prepared for these differences, again, the very worst that it will be is counterintuitive. It won't be contradictory. It won't be inconsistent.
So one way to bring out the difference between the finite and the infinite is to think about somebody counting. So imagine George is counting to 10, and he's got as far as 5. How many numbers has he got left to count? He's got 5 numbers left to count, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. But now imagine George is going to count all of the numbers, every single counting number. He's got up as far as 5. How many numbers has he got left to count? He's got infinitely many numbers still left to count. What about when he gets to 10? How many numbers has he got left to count? He's still got infinitely many numbers left to count. So his task isn't going down over time. But when he's counting a finite set, his task is going down over time.
First, I find it interesting that people are willing to accept that our everyday intuitions can't be applied to the infinite, but that's not a reason to reject the existence of the infinite. But many of those same people try to apply everyday intuitions to God, like to him being timeless or changeless, saying that, well, since we don't understand what that's like, we have to reject God because it's not like our normal experience. If we can...
Yeah, so it's interesting that Trent makes this remark, because the exact same thing, he's pointing one finger, but 3 or 4 other fingers are pointing back to him, right? He is trying to apply his intuitions to the case of infinity and saying that that's impossible, but yet he is not willing to apply those intuitions to his own model of God, right? He has a very counterintuitive, very unintuitive model of God. God is just numerically identical to the subsistent act of being itself. Omniscience is numerically identical to omnipotence, which is numerically identical to necessary existence, which is necessarily identical to God's aseity, which is, and so on, numerically identical to his timelessness, and so on. So, again, Trent can criticize other people for applying intuitions to the God case and not applying them to the infinite case. But Trent is thereby committing the same sort of thing that he's accusing these other people of doing, just in reverse. Trent is applying his intuitions to the infinite case and then not applying them to God. If we're going to reject the actual infinite just because it's, let's say, counterintuitive or has certain unintuitive aspects of it, well then he's going to have to do the same thing with respect to God. Now, of course, we can get into the fact that, okay, well, these only provide some kind of prima facie defeasible justification, and that justification can be overridden by sufficiently countervailing considerations. That's perfectly fine. That's perfectly kosher. But then that's a double-edged sword, right? Because there are lots of different modal epistemological tools that you can do to justify the possibility of an actual infinite. I covered those in my last video, so people can check that out. But you can talk about conceivability, providing defeasible evidence for possibility, imaginability, and perceptual criteria. You can talk about modal uniformity. You can talk about all different sorts of things. So anyway, I just wanted to point that out.
Except that infinity is odd and it exists. Why can't we do the same for God? Second, Craig and other defenders of the Kalam argument, they have no problem with things like Cantor's principle of one-to-one correspondence. The problem arises only when you try to assert that 3 separate propositions relating to sets and infinity are all true. In Logic and Theism, the atheist Jordan Howard Sobel has said the Kalam argument, it forces us to choose between 3 propositions. The first is Euclid's principle is true, or that a thing's parts are always smaller than the whole. Part is smaller than a whole. The second is Cantor's principle, or that a thing's part is not always smaller than the whole, if the two can be placed in one-to-one correspondence. We see this with infinite sets, like how the even numbers, that set, is the same size as the natural numbers.
Right, incidentally, this is a reason why we should delete this word physical here. Even if there is an actually infinite set of mathematical objects, which are non-physical, you would still have a contradiction between and among these 3 theses, right? Because you would be able to have the infinite set of the natural numbers, which is such that it would be both true of it, that its parts are always smaller than it, and not always smaller than it, because it has Cantor's property. So we should delete this little physical thing, and we should just say there's an actually infinite set of objects, simpliciter. Interestingly, though, what I believe, because I listened to this, I actually, when I went on a run just now, I was listening to the next, 20 minutes of what Trent had to say. I believe Trent says we should go on to reject this, but actually what that tells us is that we should go on to reject that there's an actually infinite set of objects, simpliciter, right? That's going to apply to mathematical objects as well. And then that's going to arguably get you into mathematical anti-realism, which, of course, Craig is fine with that because Craig is a nominalist. But there are lots of pretty powerful arguments for mathematical realism. And if your Kalam argument is going to commit you to mathematical anti-realism, that's a big no-no. We have indispensability arguments for mathematical realism. We have very powerful arguments for mathematical realism. Indeed, intuition and common sense itself supports mathematical realism. That's the very sort of intuition that these people are relying on for the absurdity for an actual infinite. Hey, here's something that's quite intuitive. There are numbers, right? If I ask you, hey, are there numbers less than 10? You're probably going to say, yeah. Well, then saying yeah implies, yeah, there are numbers. There exist numbers. But numbers clearly aren't like physical objects. You can't bump into the number 2. You can't destroy the number 2 in your garage or something like that. No, numbers would be mathematical objects. And of course, if there are numbers, well, then you're going to be able to get that there are infinitely many numbers, because for any number, you can just add 1 to it, and that in turn you will get another number as a result of that, and that number is going to be equally existent as the one before it. Moreover, if we grant that there are prime numbers, well, then we can show that there are infinitely many, because if there were only finite many, we could multiply them all together, we could add 1, and then we could prove that the resultant number is itself a prime number, which contradicts our original assumption that we took all the finite numbers and had them into a set that was finite. And so it seems to me that intuition and so on is going to be supporting mathematical realism. Also, it just seems intuitively true that 1 plus 1 equals 2, and that seems intuitively necessarily true. That doesn't seem to depend on anyone's mind. It doesn't seem to be like a matter of opinion. That seems to be objectively and necessarily true. And if that's the case, well then, it seems as though truths also need to correspond to reality in some manner, right? Truths are true because reality is a certain way. And so 1 plus 1 would be equaling 2 because reality is a certain way, and that doesn't seem to make any sense apart from there being these numbers, the number 1 and the number 2 and so on, the plus function and the equals function, that could serve to be that to which this truth corresponds. Without these things, it would seem as though this truth really isn't properly corresponding to some portion of reality. We're not just talking about one apple and another apple make 2 apples, because the truth would be true even if there were no apples, and so on. So it seems to me that there are some pretty intuitive reasons for thinking, and again, I'm just relying on the intuition that Trent and Craig and so on are relying on here, to think that mathematical realism is true. And yet, as I just argued, that's not going to be compatible with this particular way of going about defending the Kalam. And yeah, anyway, there are just lots and lots of reasons that one might be a mathematical realist. Indeed, one of the most prominent ways to deny mathematical realism is to take a kind of fictionalist approach, but arguably fictionalism is self-defeating because you have to quantify over fictions, which would have to be abstract objects, yet they don't want to count them as abstract objects, so that's kind of the self-defeating argument against fictionalist nominalism. And I know I went over with these with a fictionalist nominalist himself, Dr. Kenny Boyce, in my video with him. It's called Defending Nominalism. So, of course, there are responses to these, but a lot of these are, by a lot of philosophers, taken to be quite powerful arguments for the reality of abstract objects, and consequently, for the reality of infinitely many of them. That's just my point here, that this just strikes me as deeply implausible way of going about defending the Kalam, just because it's going to arguably have to commit you to mathematical anti-realism, and that's just, that's going to be problematic. And indeed, it's problematic by the very reasons that these people are relying on, namely like intuition and so on, for ruling out an actual infinite. I'm trying to start this. It's not starting.
That set is the same size as the natural numbers, even though even numbers are a part of natural numbers. Now, one way to have both of these propositions to be true is if Cantor's principle only refers to collections of abstract objects like sets, whereas collections of material objects always follow Euclid's principle. The part is smaller than the whole. But then there's the third proposition. There is a group of physical objects that contain an actually infinite number of members. Sobel says that not all of these 3 propositions can be true, and that makes sense. Because they're physical objects, they should follow Euclid's principle. Part is smaller than whole. But because they're infinite in number, they also follow Cantor's principle. So what do? Well, Sobel's solution is we just restrict Euclid's principle. We say that we can't apply it to actually infinite sets of physical objects.
Just a quick thing. He said because they're physical things, parts are going to be smaller than their whole with respect to Euclid's principle. I have no clue why that intuition would only be restricted to physical things. If we also had non-physical things like Cartesian egos or Cartesian souls, Euclid's principle would maintain all the same intuitive force that is allegedly behind it. So this would also apply to non-physical things, and it would apply to both concrete and abstract things. Parts, it's just about the nature of parts and wholes. That has nothing to do specifically with physicality as such. So again, my point about the fact that you could take out, and you should take out physical here, because you still have a contradiction if it's just an infinite set of objects together with these 2 things, these 2 principles, you'd still get the contradiction. So my point still stands.
Solution is we just restrict Euclid's principle. We say that we can't apply it to actually infinite sets of physical objects. Of course, as operations and properties are extended from finite to transfinite cardinals, infinite numbers, some arithmetic principles are left confined to the finite. But as Craig notes, Sobel hasn't...
Yes, but again, we're talking about arithmetic systems. There are other systems, for instance, set theoretic ones, where you do have more well-defined principles that are relevantly akin to arithmetic operations, that do allow you to do subtractions, or at least notions that are relevantly similar to subtraction, on infinite sets that make perfect sense mathematically. So again, this whole point about trying to restrict to the finite certain arithmetical principles in certain systems seems to me neither here nor there. We could just move to another system that allows us to mathematically perfectly well define the relevant operations performed on Hilbert total and so on. That's what I'm referring to. And I already went through a kind of set theoretic version of that in the principle of set difference. So,
infinite numbers. Some arithmetic principles are left confined to the finite. But as Craig notes, Sobel hasn't given us a reason why this is the choice we have to make. You could just as easily say Euclid and Cantor's principles are both true, and that Euclid's principle applies to every set of objects in the physical world, because there are no actually infinite sets.
Yes, you could do that, but the onus of justification here is not on Sobel to point out that we should be restricting Cantor's principle or whatever to the finite. The onus of justification here is rather on the proponent of the Kalam to show that the one that we should be rejecting is the actual infinite among those three. And yet, as I take it, plausibly, Sobel can be, or at least I would buttress Sobel's point by saying we haven't been given sufficient reason to think that that's the one that we should reject out of these three. Why not instead simply confine the Euclid's principle or whatever? I think I said Cantor's principle earlier. Apologies about that. But why not simply restrict Euclid's principle to the finite? The Kalam proponent is the one making a positive argument in this dialectical context. And so it's the Kalam proponent that needs to give us some reason for thinking that we should get rid, that the assumption among this three, that we should get rid of, the solution that we should take is getting rid of that third one, that there can be actually infinite collections of things. Why should we reject that one instead of simply restricting Euclid's principle? And again, it's neither here nor there whether J.H. Sobel has given some positive reason for taking this restriction approach. What really matters is that the Kalam proponent hasn't given us a reason for not taking this approach. And yet, they would need to give us a positive reason for not taking this approach and instead rejecting that third assumption in order to justify their Kalam cosmological argument.
And properties are extended from finite to transfinite cardinals, infinite numbers. Some arithmetic principles are left confined to the finite. But as Craig notes, Sobel hasn't given us a reason why this is the choice we have to make. You could just as easily say Euclid and Cantor's principles are both true, and that Euclid's principle applies to every set of objects in the physical world, because there are no actually infinite sets.
Yes, you could say that, but the point is just that why? Why should we prefer that way of going over the over Sobel's way of going? And the onus of justification here is on the proponent of the Kalam to justify why we should take one as opposed to the other. Again, it's neither here nor there whether J.H. Sobel has given positive justification for thinking that we should take his approach rather than another approach.
Of physical objects. If there were...
And again, Trent keeps on saying physical objects, but as I pointed out earlier, this is going to be applying to any objects whatsoever.
You could perform the mathematical operations in accord with Euclid's principle that Sobel says you can't perform. I mean, who's going to be there to stop you?
Again, this is just simply a matter of the arithmetic operations within a particular mathematical system. There are other mathematical systems that do allow you to do these relevant operations that are entirely mathematically consistent. And so this whole point about, oh, well, you can slap the mathematician on the wrist, but you can't prevent the actual infinite from doing these operations, again, that's just neither here nor there.
Euclid, Sobel. Remember how Craig put it in his debate with Lawrence Krauss.
The inverse operations of subtraction and division are prohibited because they lead to contradictions. But while you can slap the hand of the mathematician who tries to break the rules, if you've got, say, an infinite number of baseball cards, you can't stop someone from giving away part of the cards.
Yes, and again, this is just a limitation of that particular system. There are other systems, as I pointed out, for instance, ones that use set theory rather than just looking at numbers and transfinite cardinal arithmetic and so on. And the set theory ones do allow you to model these sorts of subtractions with infinite sets. You can do the subtraction and have it be mathematically coherent, mathematically well-defined, at least a relevant sense of subtraction in the notion of set difference. And that does mathematically capture what happens in concrete reality when you do these manipulations. So again, it's neither here nor there that one particular system of mathematics doesn't allow you to do that. Yeah, all different sorts of particular mathematical systems don't allow you to do certain things. Certain things are prohibited in those systems, so that's neither here nor there for whether or not those operations in reality are performable.
And so you will have contradictions when you translate it into reality,
It may be possible on paper in the realm of mathematics, but it's not possible in the realm of reality.
Again, as I've explained, though, there are no contradictions that obtain, for instance, when you're manipulating the members of the hotel around and so on. There are no contradictions in reality. Maybe he means these are metaphysical absurdities by contradiction. Again, that's sloppy and potentially misleading usage of the term contradiction, as I was making at the beginning, a point that I was making at the beginning of this video. But if that's what he means, then, again, it's just reasserting one of the very things in contention, that these things are metaphysically impossible.
Rejecting actually infinite sets in the physical world, it avoids paradoxes and doesn't create.
Well, the very question at issue is whether or not they're paradoxical in the sense of problematic inconsistencies or even problematic unintuitive consequences.
Of reality.
Rejecting actually infinite sets in the physical world, it avoids paradoxes and doesn't create any paradoxes of its own.
Well, that I've already explained that that's not quite true. I mean, if paradoxes, it depends on what we mean by paradoxes. It does create problems of its own. At least let me say that. Because, as I explained earlier, when Trent was laying out those three theses, the third one is going to have to apply to all objects simpliciter, right? You're not going to be able to have an infinite collection of objects simpliciter. You're going to have to just give that up. You're going to have to say that actually that's metaphysically impossible. That is going to land you in bunches of problems, namely the panoply of arguments for mathematical realism.
And the less paradoxical theory, it stands a much better chance of being the correct theory.
One classic
It actually has many, many, many problems, so it's not at all clear that it has a much better chance of being a better theory.
example that Craig has given to show infinity cannot exist is that of Hilbert's infinite hotel.
The mathematician David Hilbert,
By the way, Alex Malpass and I did a systematic investigation of this particular video, and we raised a bunch of, by my lights, quite forceful criticisms of it, so I highly recommend you guys check that out. That is in the Kalam playlist, and I'll probably also put it in the description.
Illustrates the problem by imagining a hotel with an infinite number of rooms, all of which are occupied. There's not a single vacancy. Every room in the infinite hotel is full. Now suppose a new guest shows up and asks for a room. The manager says, sure, no problem. Then moves the guest who was in room number 1 to room number 2, and the guest who was in room number 2 to room number 3, and so on to infinity. As a result of this shuffling, room number 1 becomes vacant, and the new guest happily checks in, even though all the rooms were already full, and nobody has checked out.
It seems Craig is claiming infinity is problematic because the Hilbert Hotel is both full and able to admit new guests. But the problem may simply be the way full is being defined.
If what we mean by full is every room is occupied, then that's true, but it doesn't prohibit us being able to accommodate new guests because we can shuffle them all up right in an infinite hotel. If what we mean by full is can't accommodate new guests, then it's just false that it's full.
It's important to note that the contradictions Craig says exist in Hilbert's hotel are, as we said earlier, they're not logical contradictions.
I really struggle with this point. A contradiction, what is a contradiction but something of the form, some statement of the form P and not P? Contradiction, that is an inherently logical concept. You just need a sentence variable, P, you need the negation symbol, and you need the conjunction symbol, right? A contradiction, that is itself just a logical concept. In philosophy, at least in my experience with it, that's all that a contradiction amounts to, and I've never heard anyone use contradiction in any other way. So, yeah, I just don't understand how you could have a contradiction that isn't a logical contradiction. Maybe he's just meaning metaphysically impossible. Okay, but then don't say contradiction. Contradiction is a logical concept. But anyway, let's listen.
In mathematics involving infinite numbers, or what some people call transfinite arithmetic, you can add finite numbers to infinite numbers, or infinite numbers to other infinite numbers. Instead, Craig is saying it's metaphysically impossible. It's not possible given the nature of reality.
So if that's what he's saying, then he is being incredibly sloppy with his use of language, and he's being very potentially misleading, because a contradiction, as basically well-nigh universally understood, is something of the form P and not P, which is, that's just a matter of logic, right? That's a logical notion. So, yeah, I mean, if he means metaphysically impossible, he should be saying that, instead of saying contradiction. It's much clearer, it doesn't potentially mislead people in a grotesque manner, and, yeah, it's not sloppy. I'm not accusing Trent of the sloppiness here.
For something like Hilbert's hotel to exist. Here is Craig's reply. As an illustrative embodiment of transfinite arithmetic, based on the axiomatic set theory, Hilbert's hotel will, of necessity, be as logically consistent as that system. Otherwise, it would be useless as an illustration. But it also vividly illustrates the absurd situations to which the real existence of an infinite multitude can lead.
And I reject that they are absurd at all.
But it also vividly illustrates the absurd situations to which the real existence of an infinite multitude can lead. The absurdity is not merely practical and physical. it is ontologically absurd that a hotel exists which is completely full and yet can accommodate untold infinities of new guests just by moving people around.
Why? Why is that metaphysically impossible? Why? I mean, you could just assert that it's just absurd. Maybe you find it counterintuitive, but again, that's not going to do anything to those who don't find it counterintuitive. Of course you can accommodate new guests, because I can show you a manner in which we can shuffle around guests to accommodate them.
Exists which is completely full and yet can accommodate untold infinities of new guests just by moving people around. So in this case, Malpass, the philosopher being interviewed, has to evacuate the word full of all of its meaning in order to accommodate the absurd example of Hilbert's Hotel.
That's just false. That is just straightforwardly false. Malpass is not evacuating the word full of all of its meaning. Malpass made a disambiguation. He said either we mean full in the sense of cannot accommodate new guests. Okay, if that's what we mean, then it's just false that Hilbert's Hotel is full. Or we could mean by full that every room is occupied, right? And in that case, yes, it's full, but that doesn't debar you from being able to accommodate new guests, because you could do those manipulations. And so there's no contradiction in that case either. And so it's not as though Malpass is taking all the meaning out of the word full. He made a disambiguation of two different plausible meanings and showed why on each horn the argument doesn't even get off the ground. Okay? Malpass isn't changing the meaning of full. Malpass could pick whichever one of those he wants to pick as a meaning. And both of those capture, I think, what we would normally say as the intuitive meaning of full. But we have to be precise when we're making these sorts of logical arguments. What exactly are we meaning by full? So, yeah, anyway, this is just straightforwardly false that Malpass is somehow, changing the meaning to somehow accommodate the quote-unquote absurdity of Hilbert's Hotel.
Accommodate untold infinity, the word full of all of its meaning in order to accommodate the absurd example of Hilbert's Hotel. But you could just as easily, and I would say preferably, say it's better to not allow the possibility of such a hotel or object in the first place than to change our understanding of the concept of full.
He was not changing our understanding of the concept of full. He made a disambiguation. He said, all he did was he made a disambiguation. He said, either by full, we could mean this, we could precisify it in this way, or we could precisify it in this way. Either way, the argument doesn't succeed. That is what he was making. He wasn't changing.
Of such a hotel or object in the first place than to change our understanding of the concept of full. In fact, since Hilbert's Hotel can accommodate an infinite number of guests, it is for all practical purposes both empty and full, since it has the maximum number of rooms available, which we would expect of an empty hotel, and every room is occupied, which we'd expect of a full hotel.
Yes, we would expect those of a finite empty hotel and a finite full hotel. But that's precisely what we wouldn't expect if we had an infinite hotel. We'd expect the opposite.
Since these contradictions are not logical in nature, you can't logically prove they're impossible, like a married bachelor. Instead, it's going to rest on your intuitions about what's possible, like how other things are metaphysically impossible.
Yeah, so this does rest, it's going to rest quite heavily on your individual concoction of seemings and experiences and so on. For me, I don't share the intuition at all that this is impossible. And so it's just going to be evidentially utterly powerless for me. But even if one did share those intuitions, I've explained how it's going to be incredibly costly to follow those, because et cetera, about mathematical realism that I've been over, and so on. You're going to have to deny an endless future, and so get rid of Christianity, and so on. So, I mean, you can follow the intuitions if you want, but we just need to be consistent.
Like an object that has color but no shape, or shape but no size, or going back in time and killing your own grandfather. And I would say that when we really think about the examples involving the infinite, like Hilbert's Hotel, when we put them in reality, we end up with something that seems to be more of an impossibility, like killing yourself through time travel, which I'll talk about later, than just a possible yet strange part of the real world.
Yes, and I would argue that that's not the case. Okay, so you can say that you would argue that, but I would just say that I'd argue the opposite. And so we just have competing claims, and perhaps competing intuitions. And in that case, we just reach a stalemate, and your argument is powerless to convince those who don't share the relevant intuitions.
Well, when we put them in reality, we end up with something that seems to be more of an impossibility, like killing yourself.
But also, that stalemate is not the only thing that I go for, right? I've already pinpointed the objections from mathematical realism. I've pinpointed objections from an endless future, and how this is going to have to require you to give up Christianity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that, again, I'm just pointing out that that's not the only response that I would make, that we have a stalemate here. In fact, I think we should positively reject the argument.
Through time travel, which I'll talk about later, than just a possible yet strange part of the real world.
In Craig's video, a contradiction is supposedly found by considering what happens when the guests leave the infinite hotel.
Suppose all the guests in odd-numbered rooms check out. In that case, an infinite number of people have left the hotel. And yet, there are no fewer people in the hotel. But suppose instead all the guests in rooms numbered 4 and above check out. In that case, only 3 people are left, and yet exactly the same number of people left in the hotel this time as when all the odd-numbered guests checked out. Thus, we have a contradiction.
And notice that this is the exact same thing that happens with an endless future, right? Imagine each of these are the future days, each of which is such that it will be, each of which is such that the future days on which the angel sings, let's say, a natural number, or chants a natural number. And so there are infinitely many future days, each of which is such that it will be the case that the angel will sing a unique natural number on that day. And in one case, right, in one Hilbert's Hotel situation, we can, God's interrupting and just saying, no, you are stopping. You can only do the finitely many. Whereas in another situation, the angel does infinitely many. And in a still further situation, the angel only does every other one. Every other day they sing a number. Here we have the exact same infinite operations. We have subtracted infinity in one case, and we've only gotten a finite number because God interrupts the whole process. In another case, we have subtracted infinity, but we are still left with an infinite number of days, each of which is such that it will have a natural number sung on it, because we've only taken out every other day. So if you're going to say that this leads to a contradiction like this, and we should reject it like on that basis, you're going to have to say the same thing about an endless future, in which case you're going to have to give up your Christianity.
We subtract identical quantities from identical quantities and get different answers.
And again, there's nothing contradictory here, as I explained earlier. This is only contradictory if you add in the further premise that if you subtract an identical quantity from an identical quantity, then you must get an identical quantity as a result of that subtraction. But my question is, why the hell should we accept that principle? And indeed, I myself, I would just take infinite cases as a counterexample to that principle. I don't see strong reasons for thinking the principle is true, and I would take infinite cases to be a counterexample to that. Anyway, let's just continue.
The trouble, that video is so below threshold. The complaint in that...
below the threshold. I'm not even sure exactly what that means, but that's kind of funny.
That clip. In particular, the one that says that if there are only 3 people left, then there's still the same number of people have checked out.
And I mean, remember, what I did grant was that this would be absurd if you subtracted them in exactly the same manner, right? But that's precisely what you're not doing, and that's precisely why you can perfectly legitimately get different results at the end of it, right? And moreover, we can perfectly well mathematically capture this through the notion of set difference. And so you don't have to worry about the system, certain arithmetical systems or where this is debarred, this kind of transfinite subtraction. Because we can have another mathematical system, a different one, that does allow us to perfectly well define the relevant sorts of subtractions that occur within Hilbert's Hotel.
Quantities and get
the complaint in that clip, in particular, the one that says that if there are only 3 people left, then there's still the same number of people have checked out as were there originally. That is a feature of infinity that has to be taken on board very importantly, which is that any finite initial segment of an infinite set, if it's linearly ordered, is such that what's left is infinite. So no matter how far you go, in fact, you're still leaving infinitely many elements ahead of you.
There's a formal theory.
So, again, this is another one of my potential criticisms of the Skydive Phil documentary. What he said there just doesn't strike me as a response to what Craig was saying. I mean, he's kind of just reiterating what Craig was saying and just pointing out that, yeah, of course this is going to happen. I agree with him, but that's not really getting to the heart of the matter. Anyway, let's just continue.
In fact, you're still leaving infinitely many elements ahead of you.
There's a formal
that's
theory.
exactly what Craig said.
In fact, you're still leaving infinitely many elements ahead of you.
There's a formal theory of arithmetic, which is characterized by the Peano axioms. And that's a language where you can express any sentence of arithmetic, like 7 + 3 = 10 or something. But when it comes to this Cantorian transfinite arithmetic, there's just no notion of subtraction. It's not well defined to say infinity minus 3.
And notice that it's not well defined in this particular system, right? As I pointed out, there are other notions that are relevantly similar to subtraction and that provide a formal mathematical capturing of what's happening in the Hilbert's Hotel cases, and that do allow you to do this kind of subtraction among infinite sets. And so even though it's debarred under the system or theory that Alex Malpass is talking about here, there are other ways to perfectly well mathematically capture it in other models or systems. It's just a slightly different capturing, but you're capturing really the same. Ultimately, you're still doing subtraction. There's a relevant sense in which set difference is relevantly like subtraction.
It's not a sentence of either the Peano arithmetic or the Cantorian arithmetic. So while someone might say it informally, there's no formal language where that really makes any sense.
Right, and this mirrors what Malpass said earlier in the documentary. But the problem with infinity doesn't arise in discussions of the length of abstract finite sections of an infinite line. They arise when you subtract identical quantities from identical quantities. In the real world, which should always be the same answer, but in an infinite collection, there's an infinite possibility of answers.
Why should it always be the same answer? I mean, it's just a flat assertion. As I was saying earlier, Craig flatly asserts the principle, and Trent is flatly asserting the principle here as well. Why? Why is it the case that when you subtract an identical quantity from an identical quantity, you must get, no matter what, whether or not the quantities in question are infinite or finite, why is it the case that you must get an identical quantity as a result of that subtraction? Why? Why? Prove it. That's what I want to say. And again, I'd make the points that I said earlier in response to this. In particular, there doesn't seem to be any mystery here as to why you get different results at the end of it, precisely because you're doing you're subtracting the sets in different ways, you're subtracting different sets, you're taking different set differences, right? We call that Google thing that I was showing you of the set difference, the notion of set subtraction.
World, which should always be the same answer, but in an infinite collection, there's an infinite possibility of answers. The philosopher Michael Huemer writes in his book, Approaching Infinity, quote, "The standard response to these problems is similar to the standard response to the set theoretic paradoxes. Prohibit the troublesome operations. Followers of Cantor counsel us to simply get used to the fact that infinite numbers behave differently from finite numbers in certain respects."
And again, note that yes, the troublesome operations are prohibited within a particular system, but in other systems you can perform relevantly similar operations that aren't prohibited at all, as I've explained. Moreover, it should be noted at least that Michael Huemer, how he debars paradoxical infinities, he doesn't say that I'm not attributing to Trent the negation of what I'm about to say, but it's important to note that these authors that he's citing, Michael Huemer, for instance, doesn't say that actual infinites are impossible. Michael Huemer's theory in this Approaching Infinity book is that infinite natural intensive magnitudes are metaphysically impossible. That's all that Michael Huemer says. Michael Huemer is perfectly fine with there being actually infinites. In fact, Michael Huemer thinks that there must be, if I recall correctly, he thinks that there must be actual infinites because there are natural numbers and there are actually infinitely many such numbers. But anyway, let's continue on. I don't want to, don't write that in stone because, it could be the case that Huemer has since changed his view on that, or it could be the case that I'm misremembering something. We always have to remember these sorts of epistemic possibilities. But I'm reasonably confident in that. But I do know, I am certain that is the particular approach that he takes in Approaching Infinity. He doesn't say that actual infinites are impossible. Instead, he just says that infinite natural intensive magnitudes are impossible. And don't worry about defining those, what a natural magnitude is and what an intensive magnitude is and so on. But anyway, again, I'm not attributing to Trent a denial of what I just said, okay? And I'm not saying that Trent is committing some inconsistency here in citing Huemer. I'm not saying that at all, right? My sole point is just that even the very authors that are making these points don't view them as problematic for actual infinites, okay? And that should be an indicator as to, well, anyway, it shows you that there are equally smart and intelligent people that don't find these at all, problematic to the point of rejecting them.
End quote.
As metaphysically impossible.
But the problem is that if actually infinite collections could exist in the physical world, then these sets could, in theory, do actual things in the world, like be the subject of subtraction or division that no language is capable of describing.
No language is capable of describing? I just described one earlier, right? This notion of set subtraction or set difference. This is a particular way of mathematically capturing this. So it's neither here nor there that one particular system or one particular theory is unable to capture the relevant operations when we have relevantly similar operations being able to be captured by this notion of set difference. So I take Trent's claim there to just simply be false.
But they're able to do these things we can't describe, which seems...
And we can describe them, actually.
...counterintuitive. Craig writes in his book, Time and Eternity, that atheists can't refute this problem by saying, well, this is just what we would expect if actual infinite sets existed. Here's what he writes. But far from being the solution, this is precisely the problem. Because in infinite set theory, Euclid's axiom is denied. One winds up with all sorts of absurdities, such as Hilbert's Hotel.
And yet it hasn't been demonstrated that it's actually an absurdity.
When one tries to translate that theory into reality. The issue is not whether these consequences would result if actual infinities were to exist. We agree that they would. The question is whether such consequences are metaphysically possible.
One of the strange things that Cantor showed was there are infinities of different sides. The first infinity is known as aleph-null. The next largest is aleph-1, and so on.
So there's this infinite number which is called aleph-7. And there's also an infinite number which is called aleph-5. And we can add those. And if we add aleph-7 to aleph-5, you might think that what we're going to get is aleph-12. But it doesn't work like that. The infinite case is different from the finite case. In fact, what happens if you add two infinite numbers together is that the bigger one swallows up the littler one. The smaller one is insignificant compared with the bigger one, And aleph 7 plus aleph 5 is just aleph 7. Aleph 7 just takes over, and it's as if the aleph 5 wasn't even there. So aleph 7 plus aleph 5 is aleph 7. And similarly, aleph 7 plus aleph 3 is aleph 7. If you add these smaller infinite numbers to aleph 7, you just get aleph 7. Now, suppose we tried to perform a subtraction. Suppose we start with aleph 7 and ask, what is it that you need to add to aleph 7 to get aleph 7? Now, unfortunately, there's no clear answer to this, because we saw that if we added aleph 3, that would just give us aleph 7. If we added aleph 5, that would give us aleph 7. There's no longer any such thing as the number that we need to add to aleph 7 to get aleph 7. And this is an example of how subtraction just isn't well defined in the infinite case.
You could say the same about 0, that 0 divided by 0 isn't defined. In fact, anything divided by 0 isn't defined in normal arithmetic. But that doesn't mean division is meaningless or that 0 is contradictory.
First, the problem arises when you apply this to concrete objects. It's hard to get away with saying things like one infinite amount swallows up another infinite amount as if it wasn't there at all, when the amount really was there in the form of actual hotel guests who check in and still have to be accounted for.
So that doesn't strike me as plausible at all. When the notion of swamping up here or whatever, one just swamps out the other. When you formalize that kind of set theoretically, as it were, you're talking about the sets, all the elements of the first set that is being quote unquote swamped out, what's being swamped out is the cardinality of that set. The members are still there, and when you add that to the other set, you include those members in the other set, the members are still there, right? They still actually exist in that other set. It's just that the cardinality of that resulting set was the same as that original set without those added members. Okay? So that's the sense of swamping out. The sense of swamping out is that the higher cardinality, transfinite number, swamps out the lower cardinality, transfinite number, in the sense of the union of those two sets has the cardinality of the larger transfinite number, cardinal number. Okay? That is the relevant sense. It's not as though, it's a façon de parler, right? A façon de parler. It's a way of speaking, saying it's as if it didn't exist. No, it's as if its cardinality didn't exist. Those members, yes, are still there, and they are being included within that final subset that you get as a result of adding them in there. It's not as though they're somehow going into non-existence or disappearing. So I just don't think Trent's point here holds water, and I don't think it entails anything about any intuitive absurdity that could be involved in the concrete instantiation of actual
get away with
actual infinites.
Saying things like one infinite amount swallows up another infinite amount as if it wasn't there at all, when the amount really was there in the form of actual hotel guests who check in and still have to be accounted for.
The thing is, they are accounted for. They are actually included within the resulting set. It's just that the resulting set has the same cardinality, has the same size or same number of elements as it did when you didn't originally add them in there. But they're still in there, and there's still elements in there that weren't in there previously.
Second, Craig has addressed the objection that things like subtracting infinite numbers is only undefined, and so it's not impossible. In a 2011 debate with the philosopher Peter Millikan, Millikan raised a similar objection.
Infinity minus infinity, apparently, cannot be given a consistent result. This is true, but absolutely nothing to worry about. Because all it means is that a certain equation, infinity plus what equals infinity, has more than one solution. And there's absolutely nothing mysterious or contradictory about any of this. It's the same reason why you can't divide 0 by 0.
And here is Craig's reply to Millikan.
Dr. Millikan says that infinity minus infinity is not defined in transfinite arithmetic. There's more than one solution to the equation. And that is precisely the problem when you try to translate this into the real world. You can slap the hand of the mathematician who tries to subtract infinity from infinity, but you can't stop someone from taking away a certain number of points. And
once again, though, we can equally formally capture this with a different system in which the relevant notions of set subtraction are well defined.
Contradiction is that you have identical quantities, you subtract identical quantities, and you come up with non-identical results.
And that's not a contradiction. I mean, you can just it's only a contradiction once you add the principle that if you have identical quantities and subtract identical quantities, then you must, no matter what, get an identical quantity as a result of that. But Craig just flatly asserts that. It's an unsubstantiated assertion.
It needs to be understood infinity in this case is not that sideways lazy 8. It's the number aleph-null, which is a number. It is the cardinal number of infinity, and it would be identical minus identicals yields non-identicals. And I submit in reality that's absurd.
Why? Why though? I mean, give some justification for that. I mean, you could just say that it's absurd, but I mean, we need some justification given for this. Now, again, maybe he'll say, "Oh, well, it's counterintuitive," and I've already responded to those sorts of points. So.
As for 0, I think 0 is very problematic, frankly. I mean, suppose someone said, there's an elephant in the quad, and I said, well, I don't see any elephant in the quad. He says, well, there is an elephant in the quad, and its number is 0. Well, I think that's very problematic. I don't think there is such a thing as zero. It means just the absence of something.
Well, okay, so I don't think there is such a thing as zero of things, but of course that's different from saying that the number zero, which isn't itself an absence, right? That's a number. It's a number, right? Things are true of it. It has a successor and so on. So we just have to, I just wanted to make a disambiguation there. We can distinguish between the number of elephants is zero, and you're saying, hey, there is an elephant and its number is zero. I agree. That's false. Like that just, it's either unintelligible or false. It's one of the two. But that's different from saying that the number zero doesn't exist. So I just want to make that clarification. And I'm not saying that Craig was, missing that clarification. I just want to make that clarification for the audience.
As Craig notes, the problem lies not with arithmetic using zero or arithmetic using infinity, but the existence of actual infinites or an actual zero in the real world. Millikan and Ahmed, their use of zero, it doesn't help here because you can just say that, like actual infinities, zero does not exist in the real world. Zero is not a thing with no value. It's a way to describe the absence of real things. For example, with the natural numbers, you can say, I have 2 books, or I have books and their number is 2. But while you can say I have 0 books, it makes no sense to say I have books and their number is 0. 0 is very different. 0 and infinity have important roles in the world of mathematics.
So I agree with Trent here that 0 is different from those other ones because it's signifying in some sense absence. So you wouldn't want to say that you have books because to have books entails that you have some books. You have at least one book. So you wouldn't want to say you have 0. So Trent and I are in agreement in that regard. Yeah.
Books and their number is 0. 0 is very different. 0 and infinity have important roles in the world of mathematics. But when you try to instantiate them in the actual world as if they really existed, you get contradictions, which reveals simply that
the thing is, no, you don't, as I've explained.
That these things, these mathematical concepts, can't have physical existence in the real world.
I've already argued, for instance, that that qualifier of physical is irrelevant. Okay, that's the first thing to say. But the second thing is, I've already addressed his points there, so I won't address them further.
We saw earlier, when presenting to a lay audience, Craig has claimed that the infinite is contradictory.
But mathematicians recognize that the existence of an actually infinite number of things leads to self-contradictions.
No, Craig does not simply say the infinite is contradictory. Even in a debate like the one with Christopher Hitchens, which is where this clip is from, where you have very little time to speak, Craig takes care to say that only a specific kind of infinity is contradictory.
The existence of an actually infinite number of things leads to self-contradictions.
But when talking to philosophers, a different claim is made.
Now, Alex is certainly right that when we appeal to these absurdities, we are not talking about logical contradictions or incoherences. Jose Bernardet, in his book on infinity, says that there's no logical contradiction involved in these monstrosities, but you have only to look at them in their concrete reality to see that this is metaphysically impossible.
It's not a different claim. In the second clip, Craig is teasing out what he means by impossible or contradictory. He's saying...
Or contradictory. See, those are two very different things. As I've explained, I would not go so far as Skydive Phil did to say that Craig is somehow, being duplicitous or something like that, or like Craig is contradicting himself. I would certainly not say that, okay? So I disagree with Skydive Phil in that regard. So I'm with Trent here. We both disagree with Skydive Phil. But what I would say is that Craig, not being like duplicitous or contradicting himself or something along those lines, rather he's being very sloppy and he's being potentially very misleading with his use of the language of contradiction there. Because contradiction, as I've explained, is a logical notion. It's the notion of some statement of the form P and not P. It's a logical notion. It just doesn't make any sense. And notice that Trent, when he was saying here, it's like, impossibility or contradiction. No, you don't get to say that or, right? A contradiction is a logical notion, whereas an impossibility isn't necessarily a logical notion. You could have a metaphysical impossibility. You could have an epistemic impossibility. You could have a physical impossibility, and so on. None of those are intimately or essentially bound up with logical impossibility or logical contradictions. And so, yes, although Craig goes on to explain that his real position on the matter is not that there is a strict logical contradiction, what he should do then is not use the word contradiction. He should instead say metaphysically impossible, which he does, but also he shouldn't be using that term contradiction because that has an expressly logical connotation, or at least it well nigh universally does.
Saying that he's referring to, as we said before, metaphysical impossibility or contradiction.
Metaphysical impossibility or contradiction. See, what does that even mean? Metaphysical contradiction? That's just not used in philosophy at large, and I've never even come across that term apart from here, what he's saying. metaphysical contradictions are just inherently logical. That's some statement of the form P and not P. Yes, certain metaphysical claims could entail a strict logical contradiction, but that's different from saying that there is like a metaphysical contradiction as distinct from a logical contradiction. Yes, there's metaphysical impossibility as distinct from logical impossibility, but contradictions are a matter of a statement being of the form P and not P. It's a structural, it's a formal feature of something, which in turn makes it a logical feature of it.
Than logical impossibility or contradiction. That is what Craig means in the statement from the Hitchens debate, because he uses the phrase an actually infinite number of things. So this is not.
And notice that Craig doesn't say infinite number of physical things, as Trent has been repeatedly qualifying with physical.
Case of Craig contradicting himself or pulling the wool over his audience's eyes. What is explicit in the dialogue with Malpass is implicit in his debate with Hitchens. And Craig would be prepared to defend it if Hitchens objected to it. But Hitchens in that debate, he didn't even make a half-hearted attempt to try to refute the Kalam argument for God.
Which is unsurprising, right? Because he's a new atheist, and lots of the new atheists just aren't quite interested in these sorts of substantive questions. But anyway, enough of the criticism of the new atheists.
To it. But Hitchens in that debate, he didn't even make a half-hearted attempt to try to refute the Kalam argument for God.
In contrast to other notions of possibility, metaphysical possibility, it's far less clear what the definition of that is supposed to be. And many of us are dubious that just simply pointing that something seems absurd is enough to forbid it from existing. In reality, philosophers have to be a lot bolder than that. And I'm more open-minded.
Hotel case is so basic that that's no place for anybody to dig in their heels against infinity. Even if you only accept potential infinity, the Hilbert Hotel and those results about it are completely incontrovertible.
Here I think that Isaacson, the mathematician being quoted, has misunderstood Craig. He might think Craig's appeal to Hilbert's Hotel means that Craig denies the concept of infinity. This might be why he talks about someone who only believes in the potential infinite rather than the actual infinite. Now, there are mathematicians who reject the infinite, but they're a very small minority. One of them, Doron Zeilberger, he proudly calls himself a math heretic. But Craig is not one of these mathematical finitists, one who would deny the infinite and say that only the finite exists. He writes, finitism would too radically truncate mathematics to be acceptable to most mathematicians. And he says that his thought experiments are, quote, employed on behalf of metaphysical, not mathematical finitism. Now, Craig himself is a nominalist. He doesn't believe any abstract objects, whether they're finite or infinite, actually exists. But that's a discussion for another time. Rather, the point is that, and once again, I feel like I'm infinitely repeating this, Craig affirms the actual infinite can exist abstractly in the realm of mathematics, but not in the physical world. Bernardite, the mathematician that Craig quotes in the dialogue with Alex Malpass, he makes the same judgments, writing this. Viewed in abstracto, there is no logical contradiction involved in any of these enormities. But we have only to confront them in concreto, for their outrageous absurdity, to strike us full in the face.
Again, I mean, one thing I just want to say, and I'm not saying that Trent is unaware of this or would even disagree with this, but I could quote equally competent scholars in the field who say, no, they aren't outrageously absurd. So, I mean, again, just quoting scholars making these flat assertions doesn't amount to any sort of argument. I'm not claiming that Trent is claiming that, right? But for someone who might not be familiar with debates in this sort of field, like just like an unending quotation series of scholars who agree with the positions being presented by Craig and Trent might give them the sense that there's a kind of scholarly consensus on these matters when there isn't.
But we have only to confront them in concreto, for their outrageous absurdity, to strike us full in the face.
Examples that are supposed to be problematic always involve admitting new guests, shuffling guests from one room to the other. And if we imagine a hotel where the doors were sealed and nobody could move from one room to the other, it's hard to think of a similar example that could bring out anything that looked absurd about it. It would just be a hotel with infinitely many rooms in. And if that's right, it does lead you to wonder whether the problem is the infinity involved or whether it's the manipulation of those infinite elements that's the problem. And that's helpful because, I mean, it's plausible to suppose that what's done is done, and you can't change that. The past is fixed and unchangeable. So that if the past is supposed to be like an infinite hotel, then it's more like one where the guests can't shuffle around than one where they're free to move to different rooms. I mean, it's just impossible that yesterday didn't happen, given that it has happened.
First, it seems like Malpass is conceding a little bit on the example. He doesn't just bluntly say, well, manipulating the infinite isn't impossible, so what's the big deal? Instead, this is what I think Malpass is saying in this clip. It's not the existence of an infinite hotel that is impossible. It's just doing certain things in an infinite hotel that's problematic, like adding or subtracting guests.
So that's not what Malpass was saying by my lights. I've talked with Malpass, and he doesn't think the manipulations are absurd or impossible. He and I talk like almost daily, but just messages on Facebook and so on, partly because we were co-authoring papers on these topics in infinity and so on. But setting that aside of his own personal views on the matter, so he wasn't committing to that, I think it was clear if you re-listened to that clip that he's saying, like, if anything, even if we granted that this thing was contradictory, like this hotel and so on, the story that we're telling about manipulating guests and so on, even if we granted that that's absurd, what's the root of the absurdity? It's not the mere existence of an actual infinite, it's the manipulability of it. It's shuffling them around, it's doing these subtractions and so on. But crucially, that isn't present in the case of the past. You can't shuffle around past days and so on. Instead, they're just there, right? You can't move around the times or the contents of those times because the past is over and done with. So what Malpass is really saying, and again, this is informed by my own view, by my own knowledge of what Malpass's actual views are. What Malpass was saying there is that, like, listen, if we're let's just grant that something about this is absurd. Well, what's the root of that? If we granted that it's absurd, the root of it isn't the mere fact that there's an actually infinite number of things. It's the manipulability of it. It's the being able to shuffle them around and subtract them in various ways. And so if there's any sort of absurdity here, it's in the manipulation. That doesn't require him to say that it is in fact absurd for there to be such manipulations. He's saying if there's any absurdity here, if there's an absurdity here, it's in the manipulations, it's in the shufflings.
But here's what I find unsatisfying.
So it's not a concession
About this kind of response. This would be like saying changing the past is impossible, which as we see, Malpass agrees. But you could still travel back in time. You could travel in the past. You just couldn't change anything. But what if you really had an infinite hotel, or you really had a time machine? It seems like, under Malpass's view, in order for the paradoxes to not happen, there'd have to be like some kind of mysterious force that would just keep the doors of the hotel closed, or would always cause your gun to jam when you tried to go back in time and kill your younger self.
So I don't think that requires some mysterious force any more than the fact that you can't cross the 7 bridges of Königsberg without doubling back on yourself would require a mysterious force. What, is there some mysterious force that's not allowing you to travel across the bridges in some manner? No. There are mathematical constraints given the fact that the bridges of Königsberg form a non-Eulerian circuit. You can't cross all 7 of them without doubling back on yourself at some point in the process before completing that. There's no mysterious force that's like compelling you to be unable to do that. No, it's just mathematical facts that just are going to guarantee that you're going to fail in some manner. Similarly, the fact that going back and killing your grandfather, let's just assume that time travel is possible. Well, it wouldn't follow from that there's some mysterious force that's preventing you from killing your grandfather. No, it's just that would be contradictory, and so any consistent story that you could tell in any possible story would involve you failing in some way or other. It doesn't require there to be some mysterious force preventing you. It's just you're guaranteed to fail. And why are you guaranteed to fail? Because if you didn't fail, there would be a contradiction that obtains. It's just like there being the mathematical case of the non-Eulerian circuit. What, is there some mysterious force that's preventing you from doubling back on yourself? No, it's just the mathematical facts of the situation just prevent that from ever actualizing, and it's not as though they're like sticking their mysterious tentacles in the world. It's just a structural constraint on the space of possible worlds that there even could be in the first place. It's a mathematical constraint, and similarly we have logical constraints on logical possibility and necessity. But more importantly, I'm not sure that Trent has fully appreciated the nature, and maybe he will, but in what he says further, but I don't think Trent has fully appreciated the nature of Malpass's point. The nature of Malpass's point is that, okay, let's suppose that there's something absurd about this story concerning Hilbert's hotel. Let's suppose that there's something absurd about it. Well, what's absurd about it? Well, let's try to get to the bottom of that. Well, if something is absurd about it, well, then it would surely plausibly be the manipulations, the very subtractions, the very additions, and so on, not the mere existence of the actual infinite. And so what that tells us in turn is that if we grant this stuff about absurdity, metaphysical impossibility, what's impossible is manipulating and shifting around an actual infinite number of things in such a way that you can get these kinds of subtractions and additions. But in that case, if that's the reason for thinking, or if that's what's really impossible here, well, then that's not going to apply to the mere fact that you have an actually infinite past. Because, again, merely from the fact that there are actually infinitely many things that have occurred, that there's an actual infinite past, merely from that fact, that's not what's absurd. That's not what's metaphysically impossible. What's metaphysically impossible is the manipulation and shuffling and subtraction and adding. But crucially, you can't do that to a beginningless past, right? Because the past is over and done with. You can't manipulate the times, you can't change them and shuffle them around and so on. Now, of course, one thing you might say at this juncture, and Alex Malpass and Wes Morrison address this quite wonderfully in their paper Endless and Infinite, but someone might say, oh, well, if the past were infinite, right, you would be able to have a Hilbert's Hotel in the present that you could manipulate around, you could subtract and shuffle. How? Well, you'd have to have someone building, let's say, one room each day of the infinite past. But I don't think that that is convincing, because I could equally say, well, hey, if there's an endless future, it could be the case that on each day of the endless future, someone is just destroying one Hilbert's hotel room on each day of the endless future. And if that's possible, then that entails a Hilbert's hotel in the present, right? And so then there would be Hilbert's hotel in the present, which is absurd. And so, because an endless future entails the possibility of that destruction of one room on each day of the endless future, and since that entails a Hilbert's hotel in the present, and since a Hilbert's hotel is allegedly impossible in the present, it would follow that the endless future likewise is impossible. Now, one thing you might say is, oh, well, no, it could be the case that, or you're going to reject that claim. You could say, I reject that claim that if the future could be endless, then it could be the case on each day of the future that a particular hotel room is destroyed. Okay, well, but why? Why are you rejecting that? Well, the reason is probably going to be because that would entail that there is an infinite hotel in the present, an infinite Hilbert's hotel in the present, and that can't be the case. But then the exact same thing can be said about the original argument, right? The original argument was like, hey, if you had a beginningless past, then you could construct one hotel on each day such that you get an absurd Hilbert's hotel in the present. But then you can then challenge that premise that if the past is beginningless, then it could be the case that on each day of the past you construct one Hilbert's hotel room, just as that's what someone is trying to restrict in the case of an endless future. You could reject that. Why? Precisely because that would entail a Hilbert's hotel in the present, right? And that is absurd. And so, again, no matter, it seems to me that whatever response you're going to make to that future-oriented version, that could equally well be turned on the past-oriented version. So anyway, and for further details and other responses, check out that paper by Alex Malpass and Wes Morriston, Endless and Infinite. They go over this in detail in there, and they respond to different responses. So before you leave some kind of angry comment that you think decisively refutes it, check out that article that they wrote.
Now, other philosophers have argued that the high number of coincidences that are needed to make time travel possible actually counts as strong evidence saying that it's impossible to do any kind of time travel into the past.
Sure, but lots of other philosophers have argued that that's not the right way to conceive of time travel, and so on. So, again, you could say that, yeah, lots of philosophers have argued that there are these coincidences involved, and that's somehow problematic. But, again, I could say lots of philosophers have disagreed with that.
Likewise, the philosopher Alex Proust has said there is something strange about saying infinite things, or in Proust's case, infinite causal chains, could exist, but there'd be some mysterious force that prevents paradoxes from occurring.
Again, it's not a mysterious force. It's logical constraints on the space of possible worlds that there even could be to begin with. Again, return to the bridges of Königsberg example. Am I going to say that there can't be these 7 bridges arranged in such a way in Königsberg just because, there would be some mysterious force that would prevent you from being able to, cross them all without doubling back on yourself? No, that's just implausible.
This view, it almost seems to posit a kind of God that exists that would protect the world from paradoxes of the infinite, instead of just saying the infinite can't exist.
No, it doesn't posit some kind of God. I've been explaining how this is perfectly kosher, and this is exactly what we say, for instance, in the case of the bridges of Königsberg and other sorts of things. Yeah.
Because that fact could be used later to prove God actually does exist.
Another example given to try and refute infinity are the orbits of Jupiter and Saturn.
Suppose that for every one orbit Saturn completes around the Sun, Jupiter completes 2. The longer they orbit, the further Saturn falls behind. Now, what of these 2 planets have always been orbiting the Sun from eternity past? Which has completed the most orbit? Strangely enough, the number of their orbits is exactly the same, infinity. But that seems absurd, for the longer they orbit, the greater the difference becomes.
If they were always orbiting, then there is no notion of one being at any given point having gone twice as many times as the other. That just doesn't make sense.
The hypothesis is not that they start orbiting at some point in time and then they've done 0 orbits at that point. But if the hypothesis is that they've always been orbiting, then it's just the case that they've both always done infinitely many orbits. There's no sense in which you could draw a graph that they start at 0 and then diverge away from each other and then one of them catches up or something. They're just both always having done infinitely many.
This was St. Bonaventure's objection to the past being infinite. And I agree, though, it's not the strongest counterexample. But we can take the observation that an infinite process into the past is always infinite and show that the past itself can't be infinite. One example I gave was from my debate with Ben Watkins, and that would be the following. All right. Imagine that the rooms in Hilbert's Hotel were constructed 1 room per year for all eternity past. Each construction worker receives a piece of paper from the worker who built the previous year's room. If the paper is blank, the worker writes the number of the room he just built on it. But if the paper already has a room number on it, then the worker passes that piece of paper along to the worker constructing next year's room. Now here's the question. What number is written on the paper given to the worker who is building this year's room?
Yeah, so this is just Benedetti's paradox, and I already addressed the entire thing that Trent said in his debate with Ben Watkins in my review of that debate, so definitely check that out. one particular problem of this is that it would also entail the falsehood of Christianity, arguably, because I imagine that the future is endless. Well, then God could create an angel on each day of the future and give it a paper and pencil, and God could just reveal to the angel whether or not the angel tomorrow is going to write something on his paper. And then the angel performs the following operation, just as these little guys are doing. Write my number on the paper if and only if the future angel, the angel tomorrow, does it. Given that there is an endless future, God's going to be able to do this for each day of the endless future, and you get the exact same construction. Is there going to be a number written on some day of the future? You get both yes and no as your answer. And hence we conclude that there cannot be an endless future. Now, I think the best response to these sorts of things is the unsatisfiable pair diagnosis. You don't need to say that infinite causal chains are impossible. And I have lots of different videos on that, so definitely check out those videos. Suffice it to note for now that this doesn't prove that you can't have infinite causal chains. All right, so let me click restart. Here we go.
There has to be some number written on the paper, because if the paper were blank, he would just write his own room number that he built in this year. But the paper, it couldn't have been blank, because the construction worker who built the room the year before him, well, he would have written his room number on it. But then that he wouldn't have written his room number on it. It wouldn't be blank. He'd get the number from the previous year. If this goes back forever into the past, we're going to have a paradox. A piece of paper arrives in the present, and it must have some room number on it, but it can't have any particular room number on it. A paradox. Now, this particular example is based on one offered by the philosopher Robert Kuhns, but other paradoxes have been offered of infinite causal chains by people like Alex Proust in his book, Infinity, Causation, and Paradox. And in that book, he argues that when you take all the paradoxes together that result from allowing the infinite to exist in the physical world, you get a strong case that what they all have in common is not doing something illicit with an infinite quantity, but just the mere fact that an infinite quantity or causal chain exists in the physical world. So that, the infinite causal chain, or infinite history, or infinite set, that is what must be impossible in all.
Well, importantly, it's not an infinite set. Alex Proust defends actual infinities. He doesn't think that you can have an infinite causal chain, yes, but he is in marked disagreement with what Trent was saying earlier, as well as what Craig believes with respect to the mere actual infinite. That's something that's important to note, firstly. Secondly, it's important to note that it's monumentally controversial whether or not Proust's case there succeeds, and I've addressed many of those paradoxes in the most prominent ones, including what Kuhns has said both verbally and in published form in my Kalam playlist, so definitely check that out. Again, suffice it to note for present purposes that this doesn't prove that there can't be infinite causal chains.
All the scenarios, and therefore an actually infinite set or actually infinite past causal series can't exist.
And again, you could run the same argument in the forward direction. In fact, Alex Malpass has a blog post where he gives one example of a forward Benedetti paradox, which would entail, if successful, you can't have an endless future, just as Trent is trying to claim that you can't have a beginningless past from the Benedetti paradox. It's the exact same structure. You have one thing performing a task if and only if no other thing in the direction of infinity performs that task, and you have infinitely many of those things of which that property is true. That's just the logical structure of the Benedetti paradox. And you can run that in future-oriented versions, you can run that in past-oriented versions, and so on. So that's also on Malpass's blog post. Again, his blog is called Use of a Reason. You can go to the post, it's relatively recent, called Dry Eternity Paradox, or something along those lines. Or you could just check out the video that I made with him on the endless future, a grim problem, or something like that, as well as my response to Trent Horn, his opening statement with Ben Watkins, as well as my most recent video before this one. I talk about it in all of those. So,
an actually infinite set or actually infinite past causal series can't exist.
Infinity is accepted by mathematicians.
Most mathematicians, but not all. Intuitionism is a school of mathematics, a very small school, that treats every infinite as a potential infinity. It denies the actual infinite. But more importantly, infinity is also accepted by William Lane Craig, just not an infinite set existing in the physical world. Now, this is me.
Again, it's not the qualification on physical. That's not Craig's view.
William Lane Craig.
I mean, of course, Craig does think that you can't have infinitely many physical things, but Craig doesn't put the qualification there.
Just not an infinite set existing in the physical world. Now, this is me repeating this clarification. I felt like I've said this an infinite amount of times. Now this would be infinity plus one, saying it.
So what about physicists?
So in regards to infinities in physics, the only obstruction that we have is an observer cannot measure an infinite number because infinity is not a number. Things that are observable cannot be infinite, but things like the entire volume of a space or the entire duration of time can be infinite as long as an observer cannot measure them.
Roger, why don't you start with the absurdity of the Hilbert Hotel? That you can't.
It's not an absurdity. It's just what happens if you have infinity. I mean, that was the major thing that Cantor had showed you can talk about infinity in a serious way.
And you deduce very powerful results from talking about infinity in the right way. You have to be careful when you talk about infinity. But yes, if you're careful, talking about infinity is perfectly reasonable. So I can't see a general statement about infinity is not physics.
I think what Roger's probably thinking is what I would think is that there's certainly a well-defined mathematical description that one can imagine where there's some function that's defined for all time that describes what's happening at all time, maybe a wave function that evolves with time and is defined for all time. How did we get to now question really just doesn't arise. At the time T naught that we call now, the wave function says that certain things are happening. And if that's an accurate description, that's what's happening. One doesn't have to start at the beginning at minus infinity and go through all the times to get to now. One is just here, now.
The problem here is that physics often includes things in models that don't correspond to the actual world. For example, consciousness can't be represented in the equations of physics, but you and I are clearly conscious beings. So we need to be careful about relying on physics to tell us what can or can't exist in the physical world, because some things exist that can't be modeled. And we should be careful when people say some things can exist merely because they are in the models of physicists. For example, physicists might use things like imaginary numbers, which are the square root of a negative number in their formulas. But that doesn't mean you could have an imaginary number of things in the real world. In his book, A Brief History of Time, Stephen Hawking described how you could use imaginary numbers as time coordinates in order to get imaginary time in order to solve the equations of physics. Now, while the models may use these numbers, Hawking admits, quote, "We may regard our use of imaginary time and Euclidean spacetime as merely a mathematical device or trick to calculate answers about real spacetime." In a book he co-authored with Roger Penrose called The Nature of Space and Time, Hawking admitted, "I take the positivist viewpoint that a physical theory is just a mathematical model, and that it is meaningless to ask whether it corresponds to reality."
Oh my goodness. So false. Now, I know Trent's not quoting this approvingly, but yeah, it's just logical positivism. Just, pain. Anyway, let's continue listening. I just had to voice my disagreement with this so vehemently. This quote here. And again, I'm not saying that Trent agrees with the quote. Of course, Trent is not a logical positivist, okay? Yeah.
So, since physics is really applied math, and we agree the infinite can exist in the realm of mathematics, the fact that you can use the infinite in physics equations, it doesn't show the infinite can really exist in the physical world. Because the equations and models that are used in physics, they don't necessarily directly correspond to the way the world really is.
Right, they don't necessarily do, but if we have a really predictably successful, explanatorily fruitful, simple, elegant physical model, arguably we're going to have at least some weight of a reason, not necessitating reason, but some weight of a reason to think that what the model says about reality is true, right? It would be a miracle, after all, if our physical model were able to predict such and such within the length of, well, I don't even know. I need to give an example of some kind of concrete prediction. Let's say that the force of some sort of magnetic field to such a degree of accuracy as if it were like predicting the length between, or estimating the length between New York and Los Angeles to the width of a human hair or whatever. That would be a miracle if the theory weren't true, right? It's precisely because the theory is true that it's able to make such astonishing predictions. Now, of course, we can contest that. It's roughly a very rough statement of the no miracles argument for scientific realism. But the thing is, yes, it doesn't necessarily mean that what's in the model thereby exists, or is thereby an accurate description of reality. But arguably it gives us some weight of a reason if, using the physical model, we are tremendously successful in predicting observable phenomena, explaining them, and the model is, quite elegant and simple and so on. At least we have some weight of a reason. And again, most philosophers are scientific realists and are going to find what I'm saying here not that controversial. But again, there are notable and many anti-realists, so yeah, I just wanted to say that. Like, again, yeah, Trent's right that it doesn't necessarily mean that the model corresponds to reality or what the model says about reality is correct. But it just doesn't strike me as all that relevant. What matters is not whether it necessarily corresponds with reality, but whether at least it gives us some weight of a reason to think that it does. That's the question.
And many physicists, even like Hawking, will say they don't care that it doesn't.
Craig claims that the infinite past is impossible because one can't reach infinity by successive addition, which is true if you only have a finite amount of time. But what if you have an infinite amount of time? Could you count all the numbers then?
Yes, if you're counting forever, if you're never finishing.
This misstates Craig's argument from successive addition. So here's how he put the argument in a 2005 debate with the philosopher Austin Dacey.
A collection formed by adding one member after another cannot be actually infinite.
Just for those who are curious, I have 2 videos in my Kalam series on the argument from successive addition. One is with Wes Morrison on one of his recent papers published. It's like a 2020 paper or 2021 paper in the Australasian Journal of Philosophy, again, one of those prestigious philosophy journals, where I think he just provides a very strong takedown of this argument. So one of them is with Wes Morrison, another one is with Elephant Philosophy, who also criticize the successive addition argument. So definitely check out those two videos.
The series of past events is a collection formed by adding one member after another. Therefore, the series of past events cannot be actually infinite.
Craig's argument is not about reaching infinity in a certain amount of time. It's about the fact that time itself, which is a temporal series of events, forms by successive addition, one at a time. At least that's true under the view of time Craig defends, called presentism, the view that only the present exists. If time forms in this way, then time itself, it can never be infinite, because you can never form a finite temporal series and form it one at a time and change it from being finite to infinite.
Yes, you can't change it from being finite to infinite, but that's not what happens in the case of a beginningless past. It's always infinite. Yes, you can't start with a finite set and then successively add one member after another in discrete, time intervals or whatever. You're never going to be able to convert that finite set into an infinite set. That's not what's happening in the case of an infinite past, of course. I'm not saying Trent doesn't recognize that, but what he said here is neither here nor there with respect to the successive addition argument. Yes, you can't convert a finite set via successive addition to an infinite set, but that's not what's happening in an infinite past.
There is a sense in which you can count them all, and it's the following sense. Given any individual counting number, however big, a million, a billion, a trillion, you'll eventually get there. It doesn't mean that you ever will reach the point that you can stop and say, done it, I've now finished, I've counted all the infinite numbers. That never happens. However far into the future you go, you've still got infinitely many numbers still to count. So no, this isn't a task that ever terminates, but we didn't claim that it did. The claim was only that you can count infinitely many numbers in an infinite amount of time.
Okay, so sometimes the problem is supposed to be that we can't transition from the finite to the infinite. After all, if we've got something finite and we add a finite amount to it, then the result's going to be finite. So no matter how many times we do that, we're never going to break out from the finite to the infinite. The problem is not so much that that's false, and it seems to me that that's true. It's just that the hypothesis of the past having no beginning is such that it's always been infinite. There's never been any point in the past where there'd only ever been finitely many. There's no need for a transition.
So you never get to the end of this process. You never get to the last biggest counting number. This is a sequence. The sequence of counting numbers is a sequence without an end. But that's perfectly acceptable. That makes perfectly good sense. The fact that you can't get to the end is indicative of the fact that there is no end.
Let's return to Craig's argument. He says the following. Premise 1. A collection formed by successive addition cannot be an actual infinite. Number 2. The temporal series of events is a collection formed by successive addition. And 3. Therefore, the temporal series of events cannot be an actual infinite. Now, as we saw in this clip, Malpass agrees with premise 1, or that you can never add enough to a finite collection in order to make it an infinite collection.
That's not what premise 1 says. So Malpass wasn't agreeing with premise 1. He was saying, yes, if you have a finite set to begin with, if you have a finite collection, and you are successively adding things to it to get another collection, so we have a collection formed by successive addition onto an original collection which was finite, yeah, then that collection won't be actually infinite. But that's different from agreeing with premise 1. So this seems to be a misrepresentation of what Alex Malpass was saying. I'm not saying it's an intentional misrepresentation, but it's a misrepresentation nonetheless.
Whole series of events cannot be an actual infinite. Now, as we saw in this clip, Malpass agrees with premise 1, or that you can never add enough to a finite collection in order to make it an infinite collection.
See, that's not what premise 1 says.
Impossible. So, the documentary rejects premise 2, or that the past is formed by successive addition, one event at a time.
See, that's not what the documentary, maybe it rejects that somewhere, maybe it rejects these sorts of dynamic views of time on which we have a kind of successive adding of one event to another over time as time progresses or something like that. It's just, the documentary was rejecting premise 1. They're saying this doesn't apply to, or we haven't been given a reason to think that this applies to absolutely every collection, because the reason that we have for thinking that this is true is in the case of when we start with the finite collection and then we successively add members, we're never going to be able to get to an actually infinite collection from merely adding finitely many members to a finitely many set, a finite set. But that's, again, that impossibility doesn't justify the impossibility of there being any collection formed by successive addition that is an actual infinite. After all, if you start with an actual infinite, and then you add one member to it, then you just had a collection that's formed by successive addition that is actually infinite. And importantly, the past doesn't involve a transition from the finite set or collection to an infinite set or collection. It's always been infinite.
But it only rejects this premise by just assuming the past did not form by successive addition of temporal events, without making an argument for that assumption, and it doesn't engage Craig's
Well, you don't need to make an argument for rejecting that. All they need to do is point out that they haven't been given sufficient reason to accept it. After all, this is a positive argument being offered by Craig. Craig is the one who has the onus of justification for proving or establishing that this premise is true. And so they're perfectly well within their rights by saying, no, I deny this. And they don't need to give some argument for that denial. They can if they want, but that would be a rebutting defeater. They don't need to give a rebutting defeater. They could give an undercutting defeater and say, hey, I haven't been given sufficient reason to accept this premise. That doesn't require them to give a positive argument against it. Now, of course, William Lane Craig does go on in his other work to try to justify presentism and so on. But I think that would take us, well, anyway, I'm not going to get into that because that would take us way too far afield given present purposes. And again, I think Trent's characterization of what the documentary is challenging is just mistaken. They were challenging, one thing at least they were challenging was premise one, that yes, it's not the case that any collection formed by successive addition cannot be an actual infinite, or at least we haven't been given sufficient reason to think that that is true, because the reasons for thinking that it is true only would apply, so the documentary said, would only apply if we started with a finite collection, and then we successively added to that finite collection. Yeah, we wouldn't be able to form an infinite collection as a result of that.
Defenses of premise two, arguing for this. And what Adrian Moore, one of the people being interviewed, says about an endless future, it's compatible with the Kalam argument, because under Craig's view, an endless future would be a potential infinite that can exist. It's potentially infinite.
I've already addressed that. It's not a potential infinite. It's an actual infinite.
So it can exist, whereas the past is an actual infinite that cannot exist. That's because if you start at 0 and begin counting, you will count a potentially infinite number of numbers.
See, that's not true. He said you will count a potentially infinite number of numbers. No. If you start and you never end, it is true that you never end. It's false that you will count a potentially infinite number of numbers, right? A potentially infinite number of numbers. That means it's always finite, but somehow increasing. But as you count, it's not as though it is true at each point in time that you will count a finite number. No, you're going to count. It will be the case for each natural number that you will count that. And so there are infinitely many numbers, each of which is such that you will count it. Again, suppose that there were only finitely many numbers, each of which is such that you will count it. Well, then your count's actually going to come to an end, contrary to our original assumption that it's not going to come to an end, right? If there are only 10 numbers, each of which is such that you will count it, well, then you're only going to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and then you're going to be done. Because if you went further, if you counted to 11, then it wasn't, after all, true, way back when you started counting, it wasn't true then that you will count only 10 numbers. Instead, it was true that you will count 11 numbers, or whatever, if you went on to 11. Let's see.
And we know this because at any point you pick along the counting process into the future, you'll always be counting a finite number.
Yes, oh my goodness, that's exactly what I was showing with the Malpass thing. Trent is imagining that we pick an arbitrary point in the past, and then as the now moves along, right, the temporal distance, or however many you counted, is always finite between there. Yes, that's true, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the number of numbers, each of which is such that you will count it, and that's, from the perspective of here, that's in the simple future tense. That's all the numbers into the future, and there are infinitely many such numbers. We're not talking about looking at some arbitrary point in the past, and then, from the perspective of that point, how many numbers will you have counted at some point in the future? Yes, that's always finite, and that's always increasing. But that is not what we're talking about. We're using the simple future tense. We're not using the future perfect tense or whatever it's called. We're using the simple future tense. How many numbers will you count? Of how many numbers is it true that you will count that number? Infinitely many. Pick any natural number you want. It is true of that natural number that you will count it. So there are infinitely many natural numbers, each of which is such that you will count it. It's an actual infinite. This is an actually infinite number. It is an actually infinite collection. There are members of the collection which can be put in a one-to-one correspondence with the natural numbers.
You're never going to be counting a transfinite number like aleph-7. And Craig doesn't deny this.
Again, that's beside the point. We're not talking about reaching some kind of transfinite number. Again, we're not saying that you start at a point and then somehow make the distance between that point and the moving now infinite. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the simple future tense, which is everything after, right? Anyway.
As he writes, the only sense in which there will be an infinite number of events in the future is that the series of events will go toward infinity as a limit. But that is the concept of a potential infinite, not an actual infinite.
So what's interesting is that Trent criticized the people in the video for not taking into account what Craig has written in the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology. But if that's a valid criticism of them, it's a perfectly valid criticism of Trent that he hasn't engaged with what the very Kalam critics in this video have written in response to what Craig has said here. And they've written panoplies in response. And stuff like Wes Morrison and Alex Malpass have already addressed this. And they've shown that this is just not true. Craig here is thinking of the future perfect tense, or whatever it is. How many numbers will have been counted at some arbitrary point in the future? Yeah, that is finite and always increasing. But that's not the question. The question is how many numbers, each of which is such that it will be counted. It's the simple future tense. And that is infinitely many. If it were finitely many, then you would actually end your count at some point. That ex hypothesi the count is endless.
So there's nothing contradictory about an endless future, though that will be challenged a little bit later here in the documentary. But Craig's assertion is that a beginningless past, that's not like an endless future. A beginningless past is an actually infinite.
So is the future.
Temporal series.
An endless future, that is.
Series of events. And this kind of collection can't be formed by successive addition.
And he hasn't justified this at all, and I would argue neither has Craig, as Morrison and I discussed in our video. But Trent hasn't shown this at all, he's just asserted it so far.
So under this view, the future and the past are very different.
Suppose we agreed.
And they're actually not, because it's just confusing the simple future tense with the future perfect tense. I think it's the future perfect.
The infinite is impossible. What does that mean for the infinite future? Supporters of the Kalam are generally committed to this idea, not just because religious texts seem to promise it, but also because some allege that our lives have no meaning without it.
That on a naturalistic worldview, everything is ultimately destined to destruction in the heat death of the universe. Our moral lives become vacuous because they don't have that kind of cosmic significance.
I still need to have you explain that for me better, because, again, it seems to me it's one thing to say it lacks eternal, cosmic, everlasting significance. It's another thing to say it lacks significance. In fact, to give one of your examples, you talked about, I can't remember the source of this quote, but the torturers, was it Nazi torturers?
Right, yeah.
You say, if theism isn't true, then it doesn't really matter. This strikes me as, I'm sorry, I'm sure it's going to sound rude, but it strikes me as an outrageous thing to suggest. It doesn't really matter. Surely it matters to the torture victims whether they're being tortured. It doesn't require that this makes some cosmic difference to the eternal significance of the universe for it to matter whether a human being is tortured. It matters to them. It matters to their family. It matters to us. So again, how do you move from the lack of eternal significance to the thought that if it doesn't have eternal significance, it can't have any significance?
Because the victim, it obviously matters to him in the sense that he's in pain and agony. But ultimately, it doesn't matter that he was ever in pain and in agony. The whole thing just degenerates into utter meaninglessness and insignificance.
It's hard to
notice that Craig there just reiterated the very thing he was asked to justify. But setting that aside, and Shelley Kagan actually pointed that out. He said yet another question is being begged again. But anyway, setting that aside, you can see where my sympathies lie with the moral argument.
In pain and in agony. The whole thing just degenerates into utter meaninglessness and insignificance.
It's hard to see how someone can claim that infinity is incoherent and then state that our lives are meaningless unless they are eternal.
Actually, infinite collections are incoherent. But
no, they're not. You haven't shown this in this video, neither has Craig.
Our lives have the fullest meaning when we see they don't end. And as I've shown, an endless future is a potential infinite that's possible.
You haven't shown that. You have... Well, anyway, I'm not going to make rude, snide comments. What I argue I have shown is that is simply false. Alex Malpass has already addressed this, and Trent just either isn't aware of it, or has ignored it, or whatever. But Trent is quoting something that has already been responded to ad nauseum in the literature, and corrected on. So, yeah, anyway, it is an actual infinite. The collection of events, which is such that those events will happen, that collection is infinite in number. You can pair that in a one-to-one correspondence with the natural numbers. We're not talking about the number of events which are such that they will have happened at some arbitrarily picked point in the future and some, and the present, or some arbitrarily picked point in the past. Yes, that is finite and always increasing. But what isn't finite is the number of events that will happen,
rather than an impossible actual infinite in reality. Now, I'm not going to defend Craig's argument about the meaning of life because it's not directly related to what we're talking about, which is the Kalam argument. However, I think what Craig seems to be getting at is that ultimately our lives lose meaning if everything fades away into dust as time passes. Now, as I said, I'm not going to go in depth into that argument. There are objections that can be raised to it. What's more important are claims that the Kalam argument would show an infinite future is impossible, which contradicts nearly all theology that Christians hold.
After all, the infinite future seems to have remarkably similar properties to an infinite hotel.
If you think about the number of events in the future as like equivalent to the number of guests in the hotel, and then as time passes, we're removing an event from the future and putting it in the present. And we can ask how many events are there left in the future. It's the same number of events in the future as there were before that event entered the present. So even though we've taken one away, we've got the same number left. That's exactly the same property as adding one guest and having the same number of guests after adding it in. So if one of them is problematic, so is the other.
If the idea of infinity is putting pressure on the idea of an infinite past, then it's going to put equal pressure on the idea of an infinite future. There's no clear asymmetry there that means that one of those is problematical in the way in which the other isn't.
Asymmetry would mean there is something that gives us a good reason to say the past can be treated in a different way than the future. And I think you can show there is such an asymmetry. One of the chief complaints against Craig's argument is that even if an actual infinite is impossible, an infinite past is not an actual infinite, so it's not a problem. What makes Hilbert's hotel paradoxical is that all the guests exist at the same time. But if each hotel room, let's say it only appeared for 1 second and then disappeared before a new hotel room reappeared, then this happened for all eternity. At any given moment, you wouldn't have an actual infinite. You just have one hotel room. And that would better seem to correspond to Craig's view of time, which is called presentism, that says only the present moment exists. And if only the present exists, then an actually infinite past never exists. So there's no problem. Frankly, I'm surprised the documentary didn't lean more into this objection to Craig's argument, because it's a strong one.
Well, the thing is, to me, it just doesn't seem that they need to, right? All we need is that the collection, even if the members of the collection don't exist, there just need to be determinate facts of the matter about them, right? So long as the past has happened and there are determinate facts about them, we don't need to assume that the past events are in reality in order for the collection of past events to form an actual infinite. This is why Craig can be consistent in saying that the past is an actual infinite, even though the past doesn't exist. Because what we're doing is we're just numbering the events that have occurred, right? It's a number of events, even though the events don't have to exist, right? We're just numbering them based on the fact that they have determinately happened, and we can state truths about them, and so on. But notice then that Craig is consistent in that manner. But notice then that that's going to translate into an endless future, right? There are determinate facts about, under Christianity, the future will be endless, right? There will be infinitely many such events in the future, infinitely many days or whatever. That's part and parcel of saying that the future will be endless. And so we equally have a collection whose elements are equinumerous with the natural numbers, even though the future doesn't exist. It's the same fact that you can have an actual infinite past, a collection of past events, even though those events don't exist, right? We're just numbering the events that have happened. Similarly, we're just numbering the events that will happen. So again, you can have an actual infinite, even though the collection, the members of the particular collection that you're talking about might not exist. There just need to be determinate facts about them that they either have been in reality or will be in reality or whatever. And again, Malpass and Morriston talk about all this stuff in much more detail in their paper.
So you can use this reply against Malpass's objection. You can say, look, what you're saying about all these future events, trying to put them together to make a paradox, well, the future events don't exist, or at least they don't all exist at the same time for one of these paradoxes to happen. You can talk about them, but they're not all together at the same time, so there's no problem. But now there seems to be a problem. If we refute Malpass's objection in this way about an infinite future, aren't we refuting Craig's argument because all of the infinite past moments don't exist together at the same time? Now, Craig has several ways of addressing this objection, but one approach I like actually comes from another philosopher, Andrew Locke. And here's what he asks us to do to show the past and the future are different, and how this reply would diffuse Malpass's objection, but still show that an infinite past is impossible. Here's what Locke asks us to imagine. Suppose Hilbert's hotel is constructed at the rate of one room every year, and each...
Yeah, so again, Trent is criticizing the documentary for not looking into Craig and not addressing what Craig has said in response to these sorts of things. But Locke's argument here has already been addressed in the literature by critics of the Kalam, namely Malpass and Morriston in their 2020 article. They addressed this point, and I gave the sketch of the response earlier, right? If you're going to say, oh, well, if the past were infinite, you could construct one hotel room per day, and you'd get a Hilbert hotel in the present. Well, I could equally say, hey, if the future is endless, you could destroy on each day of the future a room, let's say, and then that would entail, assuming that you don't build further rooms and so on, that would entail that you have an actual infinite Hilbert hotel in the present, right? And again, whatever response you're going to want to say to the future one, you could say to this past one. And Alex Malpass and Wes Morriston go through this in their article. Again, read the article.
Each room is equipped with a device that creates an immortal guest who checks in. Kind of like my example of building the hotel over time with paper passers. Now, if this process happened across the span of an infinite past, then in the present moment, there would be a hotel with an actually infinite number of rooms, each of which is occupied.
The same thing is true of the future, right? If you've been destroying one hotel room per day of the future and you're never creating any more hotel rooms, you're equally going to entail a Hilbert hotel in the present. So the same thing is true of an endless future, even though you're just destroying a room on each day of the future.
And paradoxically, actually, every moment in the past, there would be a hotel with an infinite number of rooms.
Similarly, paradoxically, every moment in the future would have a Hilbert hotel.
Just like when I gave the counting example with the blocks stacked as the tower, just as like every moment in the past you'd have an infinitely high tower, which doesn't make sense, you would have a hotel with an infinite number of rooms if the rooms were built one room 1 year at a time. And you would have that with an infinite past. It would be actually infinite at every moment in the past. But if you built one room at a time, starting in the present, going to an endless future, you would only have a finite hotel.
Yes, that's why we're not building, we are destroying.
Just like you would have a finite collection of counting blocks. So then we can take all of this and use it to create Locke's version of the Kalam argument. It would go like this. If an infinite past is metaphysically possible, then Hilbert's hotel is metaphysically possible.
Here's what I would say. If an infinite future is metaphysically possible, then Hilbert's hotel is metaphysically possible, for the exact same reason that he gave here. But then you can say Hilbert's hotel is not metaphysically possible. I don't accept that premise. I don't think there's a good reason to, or at least by my lights, I haven't been given a good reason to believe that premise. But let's just grant that. Then it would follow that an infinite future is not metaphysically possible, in which case it would follow that Christianity is necessarily false.
Hilbert's hotel is not metaphysically possible. Therefore, an infinite past is not metaphysically possible. Okay? Now, a few things about this argument. First, it doesn't require us to say the past itself is an actual infinite. It only commits us to the view.
Similarly, the future-oriented one doesn't require us to say that the future itself is actually infinite. An endless future is actually infinite.
That in an infinite past, you could have impossible states of affairs.
And in an endless future, you could have impossible states of affairs.
Like Hilbert's hotel.
Like, allegedly, Hilbert's hotel.
We're not saying the past is a contradiction, but that the past, an infinite past, entails contradictions.
And similarly, I can equally say that the endless future entails a contradiction.
And so there cannot be an infinite past.
And so there cannot be an endless future.
And as I said before, you can't apply this to an endless future.
And as I said before, you can.
Because if you kept building in an endless future, you would always have a finite hotel.
Yes, but we're not building, we're destroying.
And no finite collection, as Malpass says in the documentary, can ever become an infinite collection. Whereas if you had always been building in the past, you actually would have always had an infinite hotel. Paradox.
Yes, and if you would always destroy one hotel room in the future, you would always have a Hilbert's hotel on each day of the future.
Paradoxically enough. So now we have an asymmetry that shows an endless
No, you don't.
future is possible, but a beginningless past is impossible.
Well, firstly, that doesn't show that an endless future is possible. Even if this argument were successful and it didn't have this symmetry, or this further symmetrical problem that I've been raising, all it shows is that one problematic feature that the past is alleged to possess is not also possessed of the future, right? That doesn't show that an endless future is possible. So that's just a false claim. But also this succumbs to, firstly, the symmetrical argument that I was giving, but secondly, its second premise is inadequately motivated by my lights. It's just not true, or at least it's not been established that a Hilbert's hotel is metaphysically impossible.
Craig's response to this problem is to suggest that an infinite past would be actual, but the infinite future would only be potential.
It seems to me that this rests on a mistake, because Craig, instead of focusing on the question, how many future events will there be, if the future is endless, to which he answers infinitely many, Craig instead switches to how many future events will have been. And that, it's true, is always finite and increasing over time and approaching infinity but never getting there. But the problem is that those two things are compatible with each other. And the one thing is changing the subject. If you say how many events will there be, and to answer in terms of how many events there will have been, it's changing the subject. But also, they're both true. I mean, even though there will have been finitely many events, it's also true that there will be infinitely many events. In the infinite future, those two are not incompatible with each other.
I believe we can still identify an asymmetry between a beginningless past and an endless future that gets around the problem of identifying things by a different tensed language. So as we saw in the block and Locke's version of Hilbert's hotel, the endless collection of future events is completely formed by successive addition. But the beginningless collection of past events is not completely formed by successive addition. You might be able to add members to an already infinite collection and form it by successive addition that way, but there will have always been an infinite series that previously existed that we know could not have been formed by successive addition.
How do you know that? You are just asserting that. This has just been a flat assertion. Anyway.
Now, this is a point actually that Craig brought up in his dialogue with Jimmy Aiken on the Kalam argument.
When I speak of forming an infinite collection, I mean completing an infinite collection. And the series of past events is completed in the present event. And so we can talk about two ways of completing a collection by successive addition. One would be by starting at a point and never ending. The other way would be by never starting, but ending at a point. And it seems to me that that second way is even more inconceivable than the first way. How could anyone successively enumerate all of the negative numbers consecutively ending at zero? To me, that seems like an inconceivable task. And I'm certainly sure that if you just give someone, say, all of the negative numbers up to -5, then he can complete the collection from -5 down to 0. But that's not the issue. The entire series needs to be formed or completed by successive addition. And that, to me, seems inconceivable.
Notice that Craig hasn't provided a single reason for thinking that this sort of task can't be completed. He's just said, oh, it seems to me inconceivable. Okay, Okay, cool. Thank you for the report. But where's your reason? Give me some reason to think that this is impossible. And he hasn't given a reason in this clip. And as Wes Morriston argues quite forcefully in his Australasian Journal of Philosophy paper, he doesn't really give a reason in his published work either, or at least a sufficient reason. So check out my video that I made with Wes Morriston there. But also, I mean, here, Craig doesn't even give any reason. He just says, oh, it seems inconceivable to me. Okay, seems conceivable to me. Now what?
Metaphysically impossible.
So in this case, we can still identify an asymmetry to treat the past differently than the future. So
and I've argued that, no, this doesn't succeed as an asymmetry.
The future events are potentially infinite, but past events that are beginningless, they are actually infinite.
And that's just not true. The number of future events, each of which is such that it will happen if the future is endless, is an actual infinite.
And an actually infinite past or a beginningless past would be impossible, because if one could exist, you could have metaphysically impossible situations, like Hilbert's Hotel.
And we haven't been given sufficient reason to think that that's metaphysically impossible at all, so...
Infinite future is not the only infinity supporters of the Kalam tend to embrace. They've also claimed that the Big Bang singularity proves a beginning of time.
Rise at a state of infinite density at some point in the finite past. This state represents a singularity at which space-time curvature, along with temperature, pressure, and density, becomes infinite. It therefore constitutes an edge or boundary to space-time itself.
The argument by Lane Craig that the fact that there's that the infinite past is impossible, and therefore that conception of the universe is untenable, is incompatible with their claim that there is a singular point at which the universe originates, because the properties of that singularity are entirely infinite.
Precisely what a singularity is, as John Barrow has forcefully emphasized, is something that involves a kind of actual infinity. For physical reasons, involves a kind of actual infinity. And this is precisely what these very same thinkers said that they were suspicious of. So to put it very bluntly and very crudely, are they trying to have their cake and eat it? Accepting an actual infinity in one context while trying to dismiss it and being suspicious of it in another context.
First, when people describe the singularity as being infinite, that doesn't mean the singularity is an actually infinite collection of distinct objects, like what we have with Hilbert's Hotel. Instead, the singularity is infinite, in the sense that the density of the entire universe is compressed into a point of zero volume beyond any calculation.
Yes, but the thing is, that's an infinite intensive magnitude, right? We still have an actual infinity here. Yes, we don't have an actual infinity of discrete, definite elements, but that's not the only way to have an actual infinite. Another way that you could have an actual infinite is to have a magnitude which is such that it has an infinite quantity attached to it, right?
The late atheistic philosopher Quentin Smith described it this way. Here's what he writes. If the universe is finite, and the Big Bang singularity a single point, then at the first instant, the entire mass of the universe is compressed into a space with zero volume. The density of the point is n over 0, where n is the extremely high but finite number of kilograms of mass in the universe. Since it is impermissible to divide by 0, the ratio of mass to unit volume has no meaningful and measurable value, and in this sense is infinite. In the article from John Barrow, Barrow wasn't talking about the singularity at the beginning of the Big Bang, but the hypothesized singularity that's in every black hole. But here's what he goes on to say in that article. People's attitudes to these infinities differ. Cosmologists who come from particle physics and are interested in what string theory has to say about the beginning of the universe would tend to the view that these infinities are not real, that they are just an artifact of the unfinished character of our theory. And here is John Barrow himself caught.
Interestingly, the unfinished character of our theory is precisely what disallows us to infer that we have an absolute beginning, even of our local spatiotemporal manifold here, an absolute beginning of existence, that is, because we don't have a theory of quantum gravity. And the very fact that we get a singularity with this infinite density, or at least something that converges to an infinite density as you get infinitely close to it, as it were, that very fact notifies us that we need some kind of union between our general theory of relativity on the one hand and quantum mechanics on the other. And until we have a quantum theory of gravity, we won't be able to tell what exactly is happening before the Planck era. But anyway, setting that aside, again, I'm not a physicist, so don't quote me on that, but I have done some studying on this, and that seems to me to be the limitations of this, because the very quote here is just saying that, well, it's pointing out that the very fact that, well, at least many cosmologists have the view that, well, no, you can't have those infinities, which is indicating that our theories are unfinished, they're incomplete, and we need a unity between, we need some kind of quantum gravitational theory. But anyway, let's just set that aside and continue.
Cautioning about the use of the word infinite with something like singularities.
Well, and I should note that there's a more technical way to put the criticism that Skydive Phil was articulating in their particular video, and we're going to be developing that in my series with Rationality Rules with Stephen Woodford. So I actually do think that there is a problematic notion here, because as you get infinitely closer to that, so you can grant that there isn't an actual infinite, right, at the infinite magnitude at the singularity. After all, many people view the singularity just as an abstraction that doesn't really exist. There's no singularity point. But the thing is, as you converge infinitely close to that, right, the pressure and temperature and so on go on up ad infinitum. And so what you have is that for each magnitude, for each quantity that you could have, you have that quantity. And that goes up, ascending into all the natural numbers. And so what that tells you is that when the universe, assuming that the universe began at the singularity and so on, and assuming all this stuff, assuming that the universe began then, we basically have a super task being performed that runs down from the pressure and the temperature throughout all the positive integers or whatever, through the real number line. And so you're essentially counting down from infinity in a finite number of steps. But anyway, that's from my friend Daniel J. Linford, and that's going to be developed more fully in the video that I do with Stephen Whitford. So that's just a really rough gloss.
Not real. That they are just an artifact of the unfinished character of our theory. And here is John Barrow himself cautioning about the use of the word infinite with something like singularities.
Well, in general relativistic cosmology, we know the long history of singularities. How do we characterize them? Why it's not wise, perhaps, to characterize them primarily in terms of infinities in any physical quantity, but in terms of geodesic incompleteness, and then to try to prove theorems that show that infinities of a particular well-defined sort may accompany those incomplete geodesics.
So we have good reason to believe that singularities aren't examples of impossible actually infinite sets. But even if the singularity were an actual infinite, just like Hilbert's Hotel, that's not a problem for Craig, because the Kalam argument does not rely on the universe beginning from a singularity. In fact, while the talk of a singularity was commonplace among
Well, the thing is, he relies on a physical theory that commits to it in order to justify his a posteriori case for the Kalam. So,
does not rely on the universe beginning from a singularity. In fact, while the talk of a singularity was commonplace among cosmologists several decades ago, astrophysicists like Ethan Siegel say the proposal is about 40 years out of date. In his article, There Was No Big Bang Singularity, Siegel says that what we've observed in the background radiation of the universe shows the universe had never reached the really high temperatures we would expect if it came out of a state of infinite density. He also says that the evidence for an inflationary universe, we'll talk about that in part 2, would show that it must have come from a finite part of space-time. So, as I said, inflationary universes, that'll come up later. I'm not going to go into that now.
And yeah, I'm probably not going to do a response to the part 2, because it seems to me that that's going to be more on the science side. Part 2, that is, of Trent's response to the quote-unquote atheistic documentary. I guess it's an atheistic documentary in the sense of being put together by an atheist YouTube channel, maybe? It's hard to see how that makes it an atheistic documentary. Yes, it's criticizing an argument for God's existence, but lots of theists think the Kalam doesn't work as well. And they're not making any particular points that seem to presuppose or require atheism. So it's hard for me to see how it's an atheistic documentary. But anyway, set that aside. I mean, I guess, yeah, it's put out by an atheistic channel, but like what I call Trent's video, or what I call like every single video that Trent makes, a theistic video. No, I mean, it doesn't presuppose these. Anyway, it could just be some sort of, attempt to get more people out of a clickbaity title, maybe. I'm not trying to attribute these sorts of things to Trent, which I understand, right? I've done clickbaity titles before, even though I make sure that they're all accurate. So, yeah.
Instead, I just want to note that Craig acknowledges the existence of other models of the origin of the observable universe.
Oh, but what I was saying is that, yeah, I don't consider myself qualified enough to speak on the scientific case really at any length. So although I might have certain very tentative views, for instance, the ones I was just expressing just now about the incompleteness of certain scientific theories in these regards, I'm just not sufficiently qualified to go on in an entire video to talk about it without doing a ton of research and consultation with professionals in the field. I mean, I have talked with some of my philosopher of physics friends, as well as people like Graham Oppie and so on, and they're in big conversation with theoretical physicists and so on, and they tell me that there is really no consensus right now in the field with respect to whether or not there was an absolute origination of space and time and so on at some finite point in the past. But anyway, I'm not going to take a stance on any of that just because it's just I'm not sufficiently well informed on that.
That don't include a singularity. But he claims that they, quote,
I'm not going to take a super hard stance, that is. I mean, of course I'm going to take some stances, like I assign some credence to their testimonial evidence that there isn't really a consensus and so on. So, yeah, in that sense. But anyway, let's continue.
Feature an absolute beginning of the universe, even if the universe does not come into being at a singular point. So nothing about the singularity can be used to refute the Kalam argument.
Mathematicians do not think infinity is contradictory.
So I don't know how he's able to say that nothing about the singularity is able to refute the Kalam argument. I mean, okay, fine, I guess not the Kalam argument as such, because you could run the Kalam argument in just philosophical terms. But the a posteriori case for premise 2 of the Kalam does, some people, like Greg, have relied on certain theories that do postulate this singularity point and so on, or at least that commit to something relevantly like it. But anyway.
Beginning of the universe, even if the universe does not come into being at a singular point. So nothing about the singularity can be used to refute the Kalam argument.
Mathematicians do not think infinity is contradictory. What may be contradictory is claiming that infinity is both a contradiction and not a contradiction. Claiming that the infinite past is incoherent when the infinite future is embraced. And claiming that the beginning of time is confirmed by the Big Bang singularity, which itself involves infinities.
Since these are all straw man assumptions that I've already addressed, nothing more needs to really be said.
Well, I've actually argued that when best understood, at least many of them aren't straw men. Many of them have cogent cases to be made behind them. And indeed, Trent was the one who is, in some cases, offering some unintentional misrepresentations, such as when he was characterizing Malpass as rejecting premise 2 instead of premise 1 on that one argument. But anyway, let's continue. I've already said what I said with respect to Trent.
Future is embraced. But in relativity, there is no eternal universe would have had to traverse infinite time in order to get to a unique now. But in relativity, there is no such notion. Time is relative. In order to tackle this, Craig appeals to what is known as the neo-Lorentzian interpretation of relativity, which does restore a unique sense of now.
So I don't think this next section is very helpful for the documentary's argument, because it's easy for the viewer to be confused, as it would assume one knows the difference between things like general relativity and special relativity, or what the neo-Lorentzian interpretation of special relativity is. So let's watch the section, and I'll show why it doesn't refute Craig's argument.
Discovery with Copernicus is that the Earth is not the center of the universe. No, but you can always rethink the Earth as you can imagine that you can add a center. Nobody prevents you from doing that. You just complicate life for yourself. And it's the same for special relativity. You can add a preferred reference frame. It's not visible, it's not detectable, but the thing is there. That's the Lorentzian, the neo-Lorentzian interpretation of special relativity. What we gain? The only thing we gain is that we can do the new physics with the old mindset. But I think we should adapt our intuition to the new physics, not adapt new physics to our intuition. Right? When we discover that the Earth is round, that's up, that down, but if you're in Sydney, then we're round. Well, you can think, yeah, but in reality, there's a true up and a true down. You can. But what do you gain? I mean, you have to adapt your intuition about up, down to discover what they're around. Physicists are not particularly keen about neo-Lorentzian interpretation of special relativity. Having said that when you go to general relativity, have a neo-Lorentzian interpretation is much harder. Because in special relativity, you just pick a frame and in general relativity, there's no global frame. I think everything in physics, monophysicists is telling us there's no preferred frame, there is no preferred time slice, no preferred time.
Craig has suggested there is a universal clock that gives us a unique now. That is cosmological time, the time since the Big Bang.
Cosmic time is the same for every hypothetical observer in the universe, regardless of his state of motion. In other words, cosmic time is a kind of reinstatement of Newton's absolute time.
Well, cosmological time is a fake. Why? Because matter, gravity slows time. So inside the galaxy, clocks go slower than outside. Point is, there are many different clocks in the universe, which they don't agree with one another, and there are many times in the universe which don't agree with one another. The idea of the cosmological time is just one arbitrary definition of an average, but I can give a different definition of an average.
All right, so this objection is basically that Craig assumes there was an absolute measurable amount of time from the Big Bang. But this seems to be denied by relativity theory. Relativity theory shows that local clocks, they run at different speeds. Like when you get near a black hole, time can go faster or slower. This is shown really well in the movie Interstellar, by the way. Definitely see it if you haven't watched it yet. But scientists can still calculate the amount of time that has passed since the Big Bang, about 13.7 billion years. So that's not really the problem. Instead, the objection is about Craig's view of time, or presentism, because he holds that there would be an absolute present moment, one present that is the same for all observers. But relativity theory says there are things like the relativity of simultaneity, which is a fancy way of saying there's no unique present moment for everyone. That might be confusing. Check out some videos on YouTube. They describe this in more detail. But this rough description should be good for us right now. So Craig's view seems to imply there is one absolute present moment. Relativity theory says there is no such thing. But this doesn't refute the Kalam argument for several reasons. For example, you could just adopt another view of time that's compatible with the Kalam argument and is more friendly to relativity theory.
Right. So that, though, could get you into trouble with other aspects of the Kalam. So, for instance, if you adopt a theory of time on which, let's say, you have an eternalist, four-dimensionalist view, well then, obviously the future would then, an endless future, would really clearly be an actual infinite because they're all laid out. The events there are just extended tenselessly into the future. They're just laid out. So although, yes, it would be an infinite future, it would be an actual infinite even if this block theory or this four-dimensionalist eternalism are false. It's even more clearly an actual infinite if you have this four-dimensionalist eternalism view. So it would pose problems for the philosophical case. Moreover, it would pose problems, arguably, for the first premise, the arguments for whatever begins to exist as a cause, in the very thing that Trent is relying on, the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology. Craig says from start to finish, the Kalam rests on the A theory of time, and so if you have a view which is the B-theoretic four-dimensionalist eternalism, say, arguably you're going to be doing significant damage even to premise 1 as well. And, yeah, anyway, my point is just that this could actually have some very significant ramifications down the line with respect to other things that are said on behalf of the Kalam. So, yeah, I think that needs to be said here.
In a podcast I did a while ago, I talked about my preference for the growing block view of time, which says the present and the past are real, and time is like a growing block of existence. George Ellis, he's one of the world's leading experts on relativity theory. He even co-authored the large-scale structure of space-time with Stephen Hawking. He endorses this view of time. So it's not like a fringe theory. I think it's minority, but it's not fringe. Or you could defend presentism, but just reject how special relativity is applied in this case. The Catholic philosopher Ed Feser points this out. He writes, "The most that special relativity rules out is a privileged reference frame that is empirically detectable. But that makes the notion of a privileged reference frame objectionable only if one assumes verificationism or some other brand of scientism, which are philosophical positions rather than anything required by the physics, and positions which, I argue, we already have ample reason to reject, whatever we think of special relativity." So this just might say that...
So this isn't really strictly true. Only, the notion of a privileged reference frame would be objectionable only if we assume some verification or something like scientism. Rather, we can just say, like, under the different hypotheses, would we expect there to be an empirically detectable privileged reference frame? And then we can tease out the implications of various hypotheses without, assuming that anything that's empirically undetectable either must be false or must be jettisoned. So I think that this claim here is false. We could just use certain Bayesian reasoning. But anyway, set that aside.
The Kalam and presentism is not compatible with the equations that are used in special relativity theory, but not with reality itself. Because we've already seen that the equations in physics, the models in physics, don't necessarily describe reality as it actually is. Finally, this objection won't work against versions of the Kalam argument like Andrew Lokes I discussed earlier, that show the infinite past is impossible just because it allows for metaphysically impossible situations.
They don't show that, but also...
Or Alex Pruse's causal finitism arguments, which show that no effect can be generated by an infinitely long causal chain.
They don't show that, but...
All right, so that concludes part 1 of my review of Skydive Phil's documentary on the Kalam cosmological argument. Next week, I'm going to discuss the second half of his documentary, where he moves from the philosophical arguments for the finite past to talking about the Kalam's first premise, which is whatever begins to exist as a cause, and the scientific evidence for the beginning of the universe from astrophysics and cosmology. And by the way, if you like this video, don't forget to like it, subscribe, and definitely support us at TrentHornPodcast.com.
You know what? I'm going to go here, and I'm going to like it, because I appreciate what Trent is doing, and I think that Trent is a respectful and very intellectually honest interlocutor, and I appreciate all the interactions that I've had with him. I've also emailed him some, and we're thinking about doing other sorts of engagements because we both enjoy talking with one another. It's pretty fun. So anyway, be sure to do the things that he said with respect to his video on my video as well. I left him a like, so if you enjoyed my video, also leave a like, and if you see value in the work that I do, please consider becoming a patron. I am a lowly college student, so any help is seriously helping me pay my college debt, honestly, and it's also helping spur me forward. It's helping me help you guys pursue the fundamental nature of reality, pursue truth with all the rigor and passion and intensity and curiosity and love and so on that I think we should all really try to strive for. So, yeah, what better way to end is there than, I guess I should say, I've decided now that I'm not going to do a video on his part 2, just because it's going to be more on the science side of things, and I'm just going to stay away from that. My channel is more so on the philosophy side. So yeah. Anyway, what better way to end is there than I'm Joe Schmidt. This is The Majesty of Reason, and peace out.